All right, so now let's start our discussion of the search for go-to-market fit, which is occasionally also referred to as the search for a repeatable and monetizable business model, right? And one thing I'll point out about this phase of the startup lifecycle is it's not uncommon to see startup founders think that this phase is like warm knife through butter, that it's going to be easy. They're like, once I have a good product that delivers a value proposition, of course I'm going to be able to grow. All I need to do is hire a couple of salespeople, put a few ads on Facebook, presto, done, easy. And then they actually do it in the real world. And there's this great quote by Peter Thiel, who was the first angel investor into Facebook, was a founder of PayPal, and is the founder of a prominent VC fund called Founder Fund. So he has a great quote that I think does a good job illustrating the fact that this phase needs to be taken seriously, which is, his statement is, look, we underestimate the importance of distribution, a catch-all term for everything it takes to sell a product, because we share the same bias. Salespeople and other middlemen, or middle people, supposedly get in the way, and distribution should flow magically from the creation of a good product. You have a value proposition, the growth proposition comes for free. No, right? The Field of Dreams conceit. Field of Dreams is a really boring movie from before you guys were born. It's famous for the quote, "If you build it, they will come." That's exactly like being completely naive about search for go-to-market fit. The Field of Dreams conceit is especially popular in Silicon Valley, where engineers are biased towards building cool stuff rather than selling it. But customers will not come just because you build it. You have to make it happen, and it's harder than it looks. That's what the search for go-to-market fit is you need to figure out how to go from a value proposition to a predictable growth proposition. And you need to do it at this stage while you still don't have that much money, right? So it's not like you can just like pour millions into the problem, right? You need to kind of be nimble and a little bit opportunistic in terms of learning what sort of go-to-market strategy will be promising. I have a little clip from, I don't even know. Are you guys too young to know what South Park is? Maybe. Okay. It was a cartoon when I was your age. That's not appropriate for children. But not super inappropriate for children, let's be clear. But there's this wonderful episode where they called the Underpants Gnomes episode. So they have a clip where they talk about, like, basically they say the same thing as "if you build it, they will come." But they build an entire episode around that. I have a little clip of the funniest statement, in my opinion, from that episode that actually I think embodies how people are often naive about the search for go-to-market fit. So if you have 9 seconds, click on it, push the play button on YouTube, and you'll have that. Not necessary, but it's 9 seconds. It took me longer to explain it than to actually play it. But in any case, let's talk a little bit about why the search for go-to-market fit is tricky, despite the fact that you've achieved evidence of a value proposition when you hopefully correctly realize that you achieved product market fit, right? So why is it that after reaching product market fit, startups aren't ready to scale aggressively, which, looking forward, if you remember, the third phase is scale aggressively, right? So here your goal in this phase is not about get customers as quickly as possible. It's find the ways, the recipes to get new customers cost effectively, right? That's the goal, right? And why are you not ready to do that after achieving product market fit? One of the reasons is that you do things that don't scale when you search for product market fit. Remember, I said one of the defining characteristics of startups is that they should be scalable. It doesn't mean that you make sure everything is scalable right from the get-go. I mean, for instance, take a look at like what Amazon was doing in their background infrastructure when they were launching their store, right? They didn't have a scalable back end, right? There's a bunch of things that you do that you know you got to find a more effective way to do it later on, but it's not the priority right now because you can't do everything and you're mainly trying to learn, right? Well, early on when you're trying to establish a value proposition, to establish a value proposition, you do not need to find a way to get 1 billion customers. You just need to find a way to get a few representative customers and then validate that they really, really like your product, right? Meaning you might have gotten your early customers using non-scalable heroics as opposed to something that's repeatable at scale. And there's plenty of examples of that. In fact, most early customers for startups are obtained in 100% non-scalable ways, right? At some point, every entrepreneur friend of yours is going to be sending you guys an email saying, I've launched this new product, pretty please, right? That's not scalable, right? Some other examples, right? Airbnb, when they were trying to get traction in New York City, which was the first target market that they thought was promising for their product. You know how they went and got a density of supply of listings in New York City? They basically left San Francisco, moved to New York City, and in the neighborhoods that they felt they had the right demographic profile for people who would post listings, they would go door to door and basically say, you know, by the way, do you want to post? We'll help you post. We'll take pictures for you. We got this nice digital camera. Like, if you think that they could grow to where they got doing that, of course not, right? But their goal was just to establish a value proposition early on. But because of that, you know you haven't solved the go-to-market problem when you've achieved product market fit, you know, often, right? Again, Facebook is an example where the moment they had product market fit, they really, really quickly got go-to-market fit, right? But that's an exception rather than the rule. Sometimes you're lucky, and it's like snakes and ladders. Sometimes you land on a ladder, and sometimes you have to go every single cube or whatnot. That's square. But most companies don't get that badass ladder, right? So yeah, you have to figure things out. So that's kind of one of the reasons. Another one is what you might have done. It might be scalable, but it's scalable in a limited supply. So like, it's cheap, it's cost effective, right? So it's not like Airbnb where you have to basically go take the pictures and set up the listing for them. But even though you can do it cheaply, there's only like the strategy you would use would only give you access to 1,000 people. And for your business to become something big, you need to have 1 million folks. So you're not ready to scale to the 1 million because what you have will only work for 1,000. You want to find a go-to-market strategy that is a go-to-market strategy to a sufficiently big pool, right? To be interesting in terms of the upside potential of your venture. You know, and another reason why you're not ready to scale aggressively at this stage is oftentimes early on, you're cheating a little bit because you're finding the people who are going to be natural early adopters of your product. Again, that might be your friends, right? But it also might be things like, hey, you know, you think nerds are more likely to adopt your product, and you know that there's this website you can go to where a lot of nerds congregate, right? Well, and your product isn't expensive enough that it can grow to the right scale just with nerds. Well, then you need to figure out how to get non-nerds, right? By the way, if that story rings a bell, there was a bit of that within Dropbox, right? So Dropbox was figuring out how to get nerds and search for product market fit, but eventually they had to figure out how to get more than nerds, and the role of like sharing and referral was so hugely important for them. And so Dropbox had an interesting way that they confronted go-to-market fit as well. Although I won't be talking about that in the context of this lecture. Right, but that's another reason, right? You went for the low-hanging fruit, but you got to figure out how to cross over to the fruit that's at the top of the tree, right? The one that gets the most sun. And then, I mean, related to that, the flip side of that is like crossing over to mainstream market, right? It's like you got the low-hanging fruit. The mainstream market is I guess my third and fourth bullet points seem a little bit similar in my list here. But hopefully I've been able to explain to you guys why this is a tricky thing to do, a tricky thing to accomplish, right? I think there was a quote in the product market fit. It's actually a quote by the person who is really, who actually coined the term product market fit. Someone called Andy Rachleff. He's a founder of Benchmark, which is one of the prominent VC funds, probably one of the most prominent VC funds in the Bay Area. And right now is also the CEO. He was also the founder of Wealthfront. So he likes to describe search for product market fit as, will the dogs eat the dog food, right? That's really, it's just an unusual way of saying value proposition, right? And I would say, like, if I wanted to build on his little analogy and apply it to search for go-to-market fit, it's about figuring out where the dogs are at. Okay, like, just because you have something that a dog will eat doesn't mean you're able to get a bunch of dogs to eat. You need to know where the dog pounds are at. So that's the way that I would think about that. And again, I've mentioned this already, but lurking in the background of all of this is you always want to remember, right? You're trying to learn this under an important constraint, which is you got limited money, right? So you need to figure this out on the cheap, right? And so there is one important commonality between search for go-to-market fit and search for product market fit, which is these are two experimental stages where you do want to try to do things in as cost-effective a manner as possible, even if it means cutting corners in some spots. Because you don't know how much time it's going to take you to figure it out. So you can't predict how much money you need. When you don't know how much time it's going to figure out, you better be a little bit conservative and not like spend so that you're going to run out of money in 8 months, because it may take more than 8 months. It often does, right? So, so yeah, you got to be careful. And so you want to think about testing in a smart, non-wasteful manner. And you don't want to be doing really aggressive marketing launches. You want to be doing marketing tests. Right? So just remember that. There's an aspect of optimization here as well, where you're testing for what do I mean by a go-to-market strategy? It is very much a catch-all term. It includes what marketing channel are you using? What's your pricing? What's your messaging? It includes all of those details, all of which, by the way, I'm not an expert on. I'm not a marketing person, right? So that's I'm not like, there's definitely I'm not sure if there is, but there should be a course offered somewhere that's about marketing specifically for startups, where you're more focused on experimentation than, a more kind of standard and routine marketing or sales campaign. And if you are interested in startups, and if such a class is offered at Disotet, I would highly recommend to take such a course, because it would be hugely valuable. I have no doubt in my mind on that. It may be more valuable than anything, I shouldn't say this, but maybe more valuable than anything financy, I'll say, because this is actually like first order important. Finance does play a role in this optimization, and we'll talk about it during the course of this subtopic. Not today, we'll talk about it on Thursday. But yeah, so there's this optimization component where you're making adjustments to your messaging. Maybe you launch a Facebook campaign, it's not quite working out as effectively as you hope. You start changing some of the messaging, right? And maybe that there's a change in the effectiveness, right? So there's this, when I say testing and iteration and pivoting, you've got the same themes here, right? An iteration might be change the messaging of your marketing campaign. Meanwhile, a more aggressive pivot would be just move to a completely separate channel. Screw Facebook and start doing TikTok ads. I don't know. I don't even know if they have ads. I'll ask my daughter. So now another thing that I'll point out as a difference in this stage relative to product market fit stage is, remember I said with validation, there's not so much I could tell you that's concrete for whether you validate it or not in phase 1. Well, in phase 2, there's much more concrete guidance. So there's going to be an analytical and, in fact, inherently financy apparatus that punchline is going to be NPV applied to customer acquisition. In practice, people call this unit economics. Unit as in the unit is the customer, and what are the economics of acquiring a customer, right? But so people do unit economics, which is just a different way of saying NPV on customer acquisition. And there's some best practices around that for trying to decide, have you validated go-to-market fit? All right. So we'll cover that in this topic as well. Sound good? So again, just to reemphasize that this phase captures still a lot of the same spirit as search for product market fit. I've given you guys a diagram for search for go-to-market fit as well. And if you remember the first diagram, you will notice they are identical diagrams, just I've changed the labels. So instead of doing like hypotheses about what to build and who to sell to, it's hypotheses on marketing or sales channel and marketing or sales message. You could also put pricing into this. The analog of the MVP is small scale marketing campaigns. You launch that campaign. You want to, as much as possible, measure and monitor the effectiveness of that campaign, right? And off of whether that's effective or not, you try to figure out, what do I need to change about the campaign? Or am I ready to scale this campaign and devote a larger marketing budget to it so that I start scaling aggressively? But, you know, the real big spirit is, again, it's just, this diagram is just a generic diagram for hypothesis testing, right? And my goal in giving the same picture twice with slightly different labels is just to reemphasize that this is the most unique part about startups, is the fact that they have these two experimental stages, which feel so different from mature companies. I'm not saying mature companies don't try to innovate and test like this, but if you look at mostly what a large company is doing, they're not in this experimental mode, they're in an execution mode, right? Execution and experimentation are very different. And so I want to make sure that that's like, you know, really deeply ingrained in your thinking around startups, especially in the early stage. So I want to talk a little bit about something I already discussed a couple of slides ago lightly, which is this idea that like you've got the low-hanging fruit and you've got the mainstream market, and that like knowing how to get the low-hanging fruit, which are early adopters. Early adopters in the case of a technology product will be like technology enthusiasts and visionaries that can see something, see a value proposition before it actually materializes, right? What the way I want you guys to think about what I have on this slide here is, think of it as a distribution of customer types in the market. And first thing to notice is that the early market, which is the low-hanging fruit that you may have been able to get predictably, is so small that it's not big enough to justify really being a VC-funded startup on its own, which is why you need to figure out how to get this mainstream market. And the labels here for different subcategories, these are labels that were popularized by pretty prominent VC, but if anything, a more prominent author called Jeffrey Moore. He was a VC at Moore Davidow, which was also a Bay Area VC. They actually closed shop a few years ago, not because they failed, but because the people retired, the main partners retired. But he's written two really particularly prominent books that, especially in the Bay Area, people religiously read. One is called Crossing the Chasm. I'm not sure if it's called Chasm or Chasm, by the way, but I think it's Chasm. And that's a book that's about what we're talking about here, search for go-to-market fit. And why does he chasm? What does a chasm sound like? Well, chasm is like this thing that I didn't draw this drawing. I stole it from the internet. But chasm is just kind of telling you there's a major difference between the early market and the mainstream market. So that like going from visionaries to pragmatists is not a little tweak. It often involves major rethinking about how you get the market. Okay? So that, what is being emphasized, and this is really the main conceptual deliverables to get out of Jeffrey Moore's book, is that search for go-to-market fit is a challenge because you've got customer heterogeneity, right? Within a market, you've got different customer types. One nice characterization is the 5 types that we see here: technology enthusiasts, visionaries, pragmatists, conservatives, and skeptics, right? And you need to figure out, most importantly, how to go from visionaries to pragmatists, because there's quite a few pragmatists that once you actually show them evidence of a value proposition, then they'll start to bite, because they have some reason to believe that by using your value proposition, it's going to help them meet some sort of goal. Maybe I can give one example of that, actually. So for instance, if you're a company that sells to enterprise, right? A typical kind of usual suspect for a pragmatist is, if you look at the market you're selling to, right? Let's say you sell to banks, right? Your product is to be used by banks. Which banks should you be targeting as pragmatists? You want to find the banks that once you can prove to them that your product is valuable, they view using your product as an opportunity to be a growth catalyst for their business. And that's usually the medium-sized banks, for instance, or medium-sized enterprise that have been growing quickly recently. Because those are the companies that have the growth ambition and want to find every value proposition that they can. So that if you credibly show to them that goalpost that you're running to, you can run to it faster if you use my product, damn, they're in. Okay? Like, this is just, what I want to highlight is, right now I'm just giving you guys an example of thinking about, you want to achieve go-to-market fit. To achieve go-to-market fit, you need to cross this chasm. It's helpful to know who the pragmatists are likely to be. And I gave you guys one example of a pragmatist in an enterprise market, right? Now, in other markets, in the consumer market, it'll be a little bit different, and different consumer markets are going to be different. If your overall market is teenagers, I don't know anything about that anymore, so I have no guidance to provide, right? If it's, people that are reaching their midlife crisis or something, then maybe I can start to guess what the pragmatists will be. But those who really want to get out of the midlife crisis as quickly as possible. So like the details of who the pragmatists are going to be situation specific, right? But the definition of a pragmatist is someone who's eager to find any value proposition they can to achieve a specific goal. And if you can identify that in your market, it can help you narrow your search on who you want to be trying to target for your search for go-to-market fit. Right? And it's very helpful to do that, because it'll give you more clarity on what the substantive changes you need to be making, either to go to to your marketing and sales stuff, or even to your product, to be able to reach them, right? But this is, I basically kind of summarized an entire book for you guys. But I do recommend that you read this Crossing the Chasm book. Especially if you're interested in enterprise IT, because he gives more concrete examples of success stories and failure stories around search for go-to-market fit for that. And I'm a firm believer that trying to absorb as many examples as you can, not just in this class, but outside of the classroom, is actually helpful. By the way, the author of this book, who highlighted this idea that because you're targeting early market and product market fit, and to be able to scale aggressively, you need to get mainstream market, and that involves major changes to either product or go-to-market style. The author of this book has, he also has another book. I think it's called In the Eye of the Tornado. And In the Eye of the Tornado is actually about phase 3. The tornado is like once you cross the chasm and you have go-to-market fit, this starts to happen fast. And so he has another book. I actually haven't read it, but it seems promising to me in terms of a concept to think about all the crazy stuff that happens during that phase. It's on my list of things to read. I just haven't had the chance yet. Folks okay with this? So again, I want to highlight crossing the chasm is about realizing the amount of customer heterogeneity we have, and in particular, the discontinuity we have between the early market and the mainstream market, and how that means that it's very helpful for us to identify who the pragmatists may be. And the reason why I don't give you a lot of examples of that is that I myself kind of wish I knew more specific examples on this. And again, I will highlight there are some markets where the chasm is tiny and non-existent, Facebook being an example, right? And that's why it was easy for them to zip through, right? But most companies are not like that, and you have a meaningful chasm here. I have a video on this slide. Again, you just click on the slide, it's going to open the YouTube video. By the way, some YouTube videos may not work. The thing is, I'm pointing you to a YouTube video, but if the owner of that video pulls it out or makes it private, it won't work anymore. So for instance, I have an Airbnb video that's broken because of that, but I also have the button for the blog, a blog description of the Airbnb story as well. So you'll notice the Airbnb slide that I have for phase 2, a few slides down the road, has 2 buttons. One that looks like a blog button. The other one looks like the YouTube button. I think this looks familiar to folks. So if you click on the blog button, you'll get content that still is on the internet. But if you click this video, this one still works. I verified it earlier today. It's just like a funny example of this notion of crossing the chasm, how difficult it is to get traction early on, but also how once you do cross the chasm, things start to grow spectacularly fast, which is why people talk about hockey sticks with startups. Until you find go-to-market fit, things are kind of flat. But once you find go-to-market fit, ba-boom, right? So this is a funny one in the context of people dancing at a concert festival type thing. So you can look at it if you want. If you got 5 minutes, or if you want to play the video at 2x speed, it's going to be 2.5 minutes. You know, you can, I find it entertaining. And I also find it to be a nice illustration of crossing the chasm, because it highlights that, you know, this is a pretty, like the structure of this customer heterogeneity is a pretty general thing that relates to, I think, something fairly fundamental about human behavior and human demand and how demand comes about. Some people aren't interested in buying something or participating in something until they see that crowd that validates that this is right for them, right? And those people don't come in until you've achieved go-to-market fit, right? But there's a lot of them, so when they come in, it starts going fast. Folks okay with this? So far so good?
All right.
So I'm gonna skip a few slides right now on unit economics, because that's what's gonna be covered next lecture, okay? Because that takes more time than what we have left in today's lecture, because it's a full-on NPV problem that's gonna have new wrinkles to NPV that you guys haven't seen before, right? But at a very high level, what unit economics involves doing is it involves mapping out your whole customer acquisition process, from lead to qualified lead to initial customer to retained customer, right? That's a whole process, right? So doing an NPV analysis on customer acquisition involves really carefully understanding the funnel that generates, right, from a lead that you probably had to pay money for to a customer that's generating value back to you. When we do this NPV exercise, we're first going to say, let's map out the whole funnel. And once we've mapped out the whole funnel, then we're going to do an NPV on that funnel. And then we're going to ask, is customer acquisition sufficiently positive NPV? So that's a nutshell of what we'll be doing in unit economics, but we're going to go over an example and go over nitty-gritty details on Thursday. Okay? But in terms of what we'll discuss for the rest of today's lecture is instead of talking about unit economics, I'll talk about some of the miscellaneous aspects of search for go-to-market fit. Actually, the things I'm going to talk to you guys about now are things that I didn't know jack shit about until I developed this course, because it's not finance, but it's so important to this whole exercise. And it's actually important to be able to do unit economics, which is the finance of it. You can't do the finance of this without understanding the marketing of this, at least in a simple way. I'm no expert, right? So I only know it in a simple way. But when we're thinking about testing marketing, it's important to understand what are the various types of marketing and sales that exist, right? And so there's a variety of different marketing channels, and we should be aware of it. I like to categorize, and it's not just me, it's people in general, like to categorize marketing into kind of two different buckets: outbound marketing and inbound marketing. Outbound marketing is like the traditional marketing that, you know, my generation and earlier generations most directly associated with marketing, which are things like cold calls, email lists, you know, TV ads, stuff like that. That's kind of like the traditional marketing formats, right? Where the marketer pushes the message onto you, right? They kind of interfere you, and oftentimes you're not super happy that that's happened, right? Like, you know, you're being marketed to or something like that, unless you're really kind of out of it. Right? Versus like a form of marketing that's grown more in prominence over the last decade, really with the rise of the internet, to be honest, is inbound marketing, where inbound marketing is more about pulling people to you as opposed to pushing a message, right? So that might be things like you're a company and you have a blog and people are interested in the subject matter of the blog. They come see your blog, and then there's a natural pull in to them checking out your company, right? Newsletters operate a little bit like that sometimes too. You know, other types of inbound marketing would be things like referral programs, right? I've also put SEM and SEO, search engine marketing, search engine optimization, right? Kind of similar, I guess. That one is actually debatable as to whether it's outbound or inbound. It's kind of like, maybe calling it inbound and outbound is kind of transforming a grayscale into black or white, right? So there's always a little bit of an element of both, right? And SEM, SEO is kind of somewhere in the middle, maybe, right? But you should just be aware of all these different channels that you can use. And obviously, each of those channels have several sub-channels, right? You know, doing, you know, a social network-based marketing on Facebook versus Snapchat. You know, I'm not sure if it's still called Snapchat. Maybe it's called Snap now. But you know, those things there's some differences there too, right? So there are sub channels, but you want to know, like, which are those channels and which ones do I want to test, right? That's an important component of your marketing testing and your marketing design, is to be aware of these different channels. And I can't do justice to the nuances of the different channels in this class. So I'm just laying this out. My goal here is just for you guys to be aware that it's important. Even if you want to be a VC, for instance, this is important, right? Because a VC needs to be able to assess, is that, you know, are startup founders doing a sensible job here? Or maybe the founder comes to you and says, hey, I need some advice on this. It would be nice if you actually know something, right? So I would say that this is something you should prioritize learning, but more so outside of this course, because I'm just not the right human being to teach this to you. But I know that it's important because every practitioner I've ever talked to has told me it's important. But also, yeah, another thing to recognize with marketing is that, like, marketing is more general than just get a customer. An important prong of your marketing or your go-to-market strategy is not just get the customer, it's keep and nurture the customer, right? Especially for a recurring revenue business, where your goal is not just to generate a one-shot transaction from your customer, but to get them coming back over and over again. The most successful businesses, that's what they do, because what that means is they only need to acquire the customer once, not every single time the customer wants to buy something, right? So lead nurturing and customer retention and the actions you take to make that, to harness that as much as possible, is also an important component of your go-to-market strategy, right? And so that involves things like, you know, follow-up emails, user engagement monitoring, right? So that you know which customers are actually using the product that they paid for and which are not. And if they're not using it, maybe you send them tips on how they could use it, right? Especially with stuff like software on the cloud, right? When I use Slack, Slack is able to know how many times I've logged into Slack, right? So they can monitor that and try to nudge me. I'm not sure if any of you guys have signed up for Twitter and not used it. You may notice that you get these emails from Twitter sometimes saying like, oh, you know, this person posted this, right? That's part of lead nurturing, it's part of customer retention and customer engagement optimization or something like that. And that's an important part. And a lot of this stuff, especially with the rise of stuff that have a loading on internet, so, you know, cloud software, e-commerce, a lot of these things within marketing, especially when it's consumer facing, as opposed to enterprise, so selling to consumers as opposed to selling to business, a lot of that stuff gets automated in modern times, right? So that you don't need to like look through a book every day and find out, well, which customer should I be sending an email to? It all gets done automatically, right? And of course it makes sense, right? And that might be why this stuff has risen in its prominence over time, is that by automating it, it's become easier to do it at scale, right? So, right. And another aspect, and this is not a surprise, I think people who do a BCom have taken at least a marketing class, pricing matters, right? And so you want to think about, you know, how much do people pay up front? How much of it is a recurring payment? Do you want to offer tiered pricing? And among examples of tiered pricing, you want to offer a freemium version of your product where the customer pays nothing, but they probably cost you something. So you actually lose money on that, in a very narrow sense, customer, right? What do you want to do there? That's part of your marketing decision or your go-to-market strategy as well, right? And, you know, maybe I'll give one Dropbox example around kind of testing. The Dropbox had a pretty easy time in search for go-to-market fit, but they did have one stumble. I don't want to say stumble because it sounds like a mistake. They just tried something and it didn't work, which was two things. Two things that they initially tried to do for getting customers was search engine marketing, so Google AdWords. And the other one was business development partnerships with large technology companies like Samsung and stuff like that, where they wanted, you know, Dropbox preloaded on laptops or preloaded on cell phones. Early on, it wouldn't have been cell phones because cell phones weren't that smart yet. But they found that both of those strategies didn't work. And what was important for them is they didn't just blindly assume that they worked at the beginning. They realized that they had to test. And they pretty quickly noticed that the economics on both of those things were like really awful for them at that moment, right? So that they didn't end up wasting a ton of money on testing that out, right? They knew when to stop. I can give you a bit of context. Like, so I know a fair amount about the Dropbox story, and I'll be talking about Dropbox a lot during the semester, because Dropbox's first business hire is a friend of mine from college. He was their first CFO as well. So I've gotten a lot of the Dropbox story. So that's why I can talk a little bit more about Dropbox than some other companies. But with their initial attempt at SEM, basically, we're going to talk about unit economics next lecture. They did simple unit economics calculations, and what they found out was that using Google AdWords for them to get on average one customer costed them, I think it was like between $375 and $500. And they weren't expecting like to recover that on average from a customer. That was including a free sign up, by the way. So the economics of that were so bad at the time. And one of the reasons for that is that, I'm not sure if you guys have seen the videos yet for my Dropbox example that I discussed in Search for Product Market Fit. But one of the things I emphasized in that example was that Dropbox was not the first cloud storage company. When they came in, there was like another 20 competitors in the market. And so there was a lot of competition between all those competitors to use Google AdWords. So that was bidding up the price of Google AdWords. And so Dropbox was like, geez, no, that doesn't work. We should just stop it, or do it at a minimum level, right? And it's because they had the discipline to monitor, how many of the site visits from Google were converting into free customers, converting into paid customers, yada, yada, right? For business development partnerships, they pretty quickly found, and this is actually a pretty general statement, is that it's very common for large companies like a Samsung to be willing to do meetings with you, the startup, under the guise of, yeah, let's do a partnership. But it's an altogether different thing to get them to actually sign, right? So basically they realized at some point they were being strung along. And the reason why a Samsung would be willing to string along is A, they learn about new technologies by engaging in conversation with the startup, right? And B, it's not that expensive for them to just meet with you. It's much more expensive for you to meet with them. So this is not a universal statement, but most of the time trying to find business development partnerships very early on for a startup is one of these black holes where if you're a bit naive as a founder, you think it's going great, but it's actually going nowhere. Like, why would a large technology company take a chance on a startup that's probably still using an MVP as opposed to a fully fleshed out product? Like, if I was Samsung, I wouldn't do that, right? So in some sense, it doesn't make sense that would be particularly prominent anyway. So how did Dropbox actually eventually achieve go-to-market fit? Well, what they did find is that their referral program was like mega amazing for getting them new customers, because all they had to do was give a little tiny incentive to customers to refer other customers. We will give you an extra, I don't even remember what the numbers were initially, but we'll give you an extra, it'll be at most 100 megabytes per new customer that you bring in. And because it's so easy for people to share the links with all of their friends, especially if they want to collaborate on a document, like people were sharing that like at a pretty substantial scale. And that's kind of an exponential growth thing, right? Because if I refer in 2 people and those 2 people refer in 2 people, right? 2 to the power of n becomes mega big, for a pretty small number of n, right? N being the number of layers that you traverse. So for them, they found that worked great, right? And so once they found that worked great, they didn't just go and scale right away that either. They also thought about optimizing that channel. So because they were getting a lot of site traffic from these referral links through that go-to-market strategy, they were able to do things like randomize between 2 landing pages that have slightly different messaging. And since you get enough customers flowing into both of these things, do a basic hypothesis test statistical hypothesis test on which of the 2 landing pages resonates more with the customer, i.e. converts into a customer sign up more often. This is something called A/B testing. Landing page A, landing page B, randomize for every visit, and then see statistically which is more effective, and keep on improving your message in that way. Right? So I think this is a pretty nice example of like kind of showing kind of things that Dropbox, as a good canonical example, did for both finding out which channels worked and which didn't work, and optimizing the channels that worked, right? You want to do all that stuff. And, once I say it, I'm pretty sure it's not a surprise to folks, right? This is not a controversial statement. So far, so good? All right. So there's just one more thing that I want to talk about today, which is, right, so go-to-market, it's sales or marketing, right? I classify those things as being different. It's like marketing is something you want to do at a very large scale, right? And you probably don't necessarily have the luxury to devote a ton of resource to every instance of marketing attempt, right, usually plays a bit more of a role in stuff that sells to consumer, because the consumer markets have more people, but that each spend less on product, right? And then you've got some go-to-market strategies that are more sales heavy, so that they involve a human touch, human component. I don't know what the word is for it, but and it's kind of cases where like you need to build trust and a relationship with someone before that person's going to take a real substantial bet on your product. And that tends to be more representative of like stuff that sells to enterprise, especially like the products that are expensive to enterprise, right? Something where each customer spends $100,000 a year on the product, right? So just know that you want to know the difference between those two things, and you want to have clarity. Are you going to have a sales-driven process or a marketing-driven go-to-market strategy? Again, like the most common advice on choosing which of these that you use have to do with how much the customers are going to be spending. If the customers spend a little, the only thing that's economically feasible is a more of a marketing, non-human touch approach. If it's big ticket items, then there's more leeway for, you know, devoting actual salespeople and the costs associated with them to customer acquisition, right? Now, on salespeople, there is one thing that I want to say about building a sales force for a startup at this stage of the life cycle. And it's something that actually I had never thought about until I had read it in a blog post, to be honest, by a prominent VC, which is you don't want your run-of-the-mill salesperson driving sales in your startup at this stage. And I'll start maybe with an analogy before I tell you why. Let's think about acting, right? I can think of like two types, if I want to classify. I love classifying things. Two types of acting. You've got like script-based acting, and you've got improv acting. And I don't think many of you guys will disagree with me if I say that the best improv actors are probably not great or the best script-based actors, and vice versa. Because it strikes me as a totally different skill set, right? With improv acting, you need to be comfortable coming in knowing, not having real sense of where this is going to go. You need to be able to kind of adjust on the fly. You need to be more reactive in kind of reading the audience and adjusting what you're going to be saying and how you're going to be playing something out on the basis of those signals, right? Meanwhile, you know, someone, a script-based actor, just needs to be just truly amazing at delivering that fixed thing, right? Different competencies, right? I'm not going to look for the best improv actor if I want to hire the best script stage actor. Anyway, I'm not an expert on theater at all. Okay, let's be clear. But like that strikes me as being, you know, fairly non-controversial. The same thing arises for startup sales versus mature company sales. Mature company sales is more like script-based acting. I mean, if any of you guys have ever worked in a sales organization for a large company, you will actually have a pretty good understanding of how script-based that stuff is. Like, you have the message, there's a fixed number of things that you say, and it's pretty predictable what you're going to say. And it's really just about how good you are at delivering that message in a way that seems like you're not being too salesy or slicky or something like that, right? Meanwhile, with the thing is, by definition, if you don't have go-to-market fit, you don't know the script yet. So should you really be hiring a salesperson that's an expert script reader at this stage? No, because you don't have a script to give them, right? So that would, and to the extent that those people aren't necessarily best equipped to create the script, that's a problem, right? By the way, why am I pointing this out? I'm pointing this out because it's actually not uncommon for startup founders to make the following mistake. I'm a startup founder. I have a software company. I'm ready to start building my sales force. What do? I go and look at a large software company in my loosely speaking vertical, right? I go look at someone who's successfully running a sales team, maybe someone who's a VP of an important sales function at Salesforce or at Adobe or something like that. And I'm like, I'll hire that person and make them the head of sales here, right? Because you're like, hey, they're obviously a successful salesperson. They've been able to traverse up the organization at this prominent technology company in my loosely speaking vertical, right? I mean, that actually seems like a pretty sensible thing for someone to do, but it's actually oftentimes highly problematic because they're not good at writing the script. And so you're actually better off finding someone who's a little bit more of an improv salesperson, who's able to adjust and is able to take the feedback that they get from customers, go back to headquarters for the startup and say, look, I learned this from the customer. I think that probably means we want to change the messaging this way. And if we're going to change the messaging this way, we might want to add this feature to the product, or we might want to remove this feature to the product, right? It's a different competency. And so you want to find those people when you're building your early sales force in search for go-to-market fit. And where's the best place to find those people? Find people who've done it at other startups that were in go-to-market fit stage. So find out who was the growth person after year one at Dropbox or stuff like that, right? It's a different, you're looking for the people to recruit in a different place. And recruiting is a super important thing for a startup. And startups that show this great ability to recruit the right talent for the right moment in their company have a much higher likelihood of success, right? And so you really want to know that. So like, I wanted to mention it because it's actually a mistake that a lot of startup founders make. They think about who the right salespeople to hire in too simplistic of a manner that is not attuned to the experimental nature of the search for go-to-market fit. So, recommend that you guys keep that in mind. Again, I would keep it in mind both if you're going to be a startup founder, but also if you're going to be an investor. Because as an investor, if I see that you've hired not these improv actors, but you've hired script-based actors to run your growth team, I should view that as a negative in investing in your company, right? By the way, so this is, as I said, I actually started thinking about this nuance only because I pay attention to blog postings of both startup operators, meaning key executives and founders, and also VCs. And this I had gotten from a VC. I will give proper attribution. It's this fellow right here, Mark Suster. He's a partner at Upfront Ventures, which is a pretty prominent LA-based, Los Angeles-based VC. And if you click on this slide, it'll open up the blog posting that I read that made me think about this question. Okay, so you'll notice I have a bunch of slides with people's faces on them. It's not because I just want to waste slides with faces just to give you guys pictures. Every single one of those slides always have, you click it and it takes you to content that is related to the theme that's highlighted in the subtitle of the slide. Okay? So I don't know, hopefully you guys like having access to this content. Again, one of the things I'm going to emphasize, like, this isn't dinky content. Like, this is the content alongside just talking and interviewing real practitioners. Like, that's mostly what I use to build this. So I highly recommend you guys build your own set of go-to sources for learning from practitioners. It's one of these things that you guys are actually pretty lucky, I'm going to say, which is we live in a moment in time where VCs and startup founders are very eager to share their thoughts on the internet. One of the reasons is, as a VC, if you share your thoughts on the internet and founders start to read your content and they respect you through that content, they're more likely to accept your funding offer than the funding offer of another VC that they're not familiar with online, right? There's a lot of competition for deal flow. And there's a a positive externality from that competition and how people try to publicize their views that trickles on to you guys trying to learn about VCs, startups, and stuff like that, which is, you have access to that material on the internet as well. And so you should take advantage of it. I mean, this was the kind of thing that when I was in college, we didn't have this, right? So like a lot of learning about VCs was pretty much like rumor mill that you would get from your friend whose dad was a startup founder or something like that, or whose mom was an investor, right? And so it would be all about like, are you lucky to know the right people? Meanwhile, now it's more democratic. So you should take advantage of it if you are really serious about this, about wanting to do something in startups or VC. Because I will also tell you that the recruiters for jobs at VC firms will expect you to have a list of people you keep track of and to be able to verbalize what you've learned from them and why you track them. If you don't, 0% chance you get even an internship. Guaranteed, 100%. So I recommend you come up with a list. I think as I announced at the beginning, maybe before the official time of the lecture started, if there is demand, I'm more than happy to give you guys a list of like the sources that I keep most track of to help get the ball rolling. But again, I wouldn't just take my list and roll with it. I would think a little bit over the course of the semester. How do you adapt the list to your own A, interests, and B, competencies? Because the best list for me is not the best list for you, right? And I've shared my list with VCs in the Montreal area for sure. So if they're like, oh, this looks like Jiro's list, that might not leave the right impression. So making it a bit more specific to yourself, I think is good. It also makes it more enjoyable for you to track and easier for you to remember. But like, it's not something, none of this, like keeping track of this stuff is not something I technically require in my course, let's be clear. But again, if this is what you want to do in your career, I almost find it to be a necessary condition. It's something you have to do, right? And by the way, if you want to go into VC, just know that there's a lot of competition. So you need to be doing you need to be investing a lot outside of the classroom, outside of maybe your first job, which maybe is consulting or iBanking or who knows what, right? But outside of it, to be in tune with the startup ecosystem and the mindset of investors and founders. So I don't know. I don't know if what I just said sounds very preachy. So apologies. But I truly believe that it's fundamental. And actually B, I actually think it's valuable because I feel like I learned a lot from doing that. Is that we will basically wrap up our discussion of the search for go-to-market fit. And in particular, we're going to wrap up qualitative discussion on that topic. And in particular, what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight one specific story, real world startup story, on that startup's search for go-to-market fit. So in particular, we're going to be talking about the Airbnb story, okay? Because Airbnb is an interesting company in the sense that like they actually had a real challenge to actually achieve go-to-market fit. It was not easy for them to do it. And they actually had to do some, and also they tried many things that failed. And I think there's something to be learned from the things that they did that failed. And there's also something to be learned about the important things they did that that succeeded and helped progress them towards reaching go-to-market fit. Okay, so we're going to tell that story because I just think it's an interesting one. And not just interesting because Airbnb is, big at this stage, highly successful, and also, thankfully, has been able to weather COVID stuff. It's also a company that's going to be IPOing relatively soon, we think. So that's also interesting as well. But yeah, their search for go-to-market fit story is an interesting one. And for a company as high profile as they are, I'll also say that like a lot of really high profile startups or things that started as startups got kind of lucky and were able to get go-to-market fit pretty easily or product market fit pretty easily. But this is an example of a company that struggled for a period of time. before they were able to kind of get themselves into the phase 3, which we'll talk about next week in the startup life cycle. So I think it's actually, it's a story I like, which is why that's why I put in the course. So we're going to do that. And then we'll talk about some things that we also tend to do in our search for go-to-market fit, which is, right, a lot of what we've been talking about so far about search for go-to-market fit has been kind of marketing sales focused, right? It's like, oh, you know, you might want to choose your marketing channel. You might want to find ways to get leads. You might want to think about how you want to nurture your lead, right? We've really focused a lot on sales and marketing. Yeah, to the extent that I'm capable of, because as I think I acknowledged last lecture, I'm not an expert on that stuff. But I think another thing that's important to point out in the search for go-to-market fit is that it's not solely about experimenting on sales and marketing. You know, in order to really maximize your success in go-to-market strategy, sometimes it's not just changing your marketing channel or your sales message. It's not just about that. You may actually need to tweak product to make your customer acquisition profitability good enough, right? So at this stage, you're still tweaking product, right? And so you can be tweaking product in two ways. You can be improving your product, or you can be expanding your product, right? Both of which can help you achieve go-to-market fit. And so it's also useful to talk about some examples of both, right? Examples of companies that did product improvements in this phase, and examples of companies that did product expansions in this stage. So I'll give some examples of that as well. So I think we're primarily going to be talking about 3 examples. We'll talk about, as I said already, Airbnb, right, for their go-to-market kind of sales and marketing challenge. We'll talk about, in the context of product improvement, we'll talk about PayPal. And in the context of product expansion, I'll mainly talk about Square and their product expansion. All right, because I you know, look, to me, like, the broad statements are super simple. Like, oh yeah, you want to experiment on sales and marketing, but actually specific stories take it from a simple theory to maybe a better appreciation of the complexity and nuance that arises in the real world when you actually try to do it, right? It's kind of like the distinction between someone who's trying to teach you how to run a successful business, and they say, I know everything there is to know about running a successful business. Make profit. Okay, pretty simple theory. Very difficult to execute in practice. Concrete examples of how you profit are helpful, right? So, you know, in some sense, that's kind of what I view the role of concrete examples here. But the underlying principles are generally relatively simple, right? And I would say, you know, not super controversial. Although, if you guys feel they're controversial, you can certainly feel free to chime in. Again, either live in person here, or sending me an email, stuff like that. Totally fine. Maybe someone has their mic on, because I don't think that's coming from here. All right, cool, thanks. All right, so let's go ahead and do that, right? So I will share my screen now. Boom. All right, so you guys can see my slide, yes? Okay, perfect. So as always, whenever you see a slide with people's faces like this, it means it's like a content link, effectively. So if you see, there's a YouTube button and there's a blog button. This is a bit of a unique slide relative to most, in that if you click on the YouTube button, it sends you to a broken link. It's because the video that I used to link to, whoever posted it on YouTube decided to make it private. So it's just no longer available. This can happen. It's out of my control. I never owned it. And I wasn't going to illegally download it. So, but the good news is the blog button still works. So if you click on it, it's going to open a web browser to like a blog article. Not a blog. It's a little bit more serious than a typical blog article, but something that talks about the Airbnb growth story. Okay. Yeah, so let's go ahead and talk about the search for scalability, the search for go-to-market fit at Airbnb. Um, one of the things that I want to emphasize, maybe before we start going into the details of the Airbnb story, is that Airbnb is a type of company that we generally think is particularly likely to have a difficult time finding go-to-market fit, right? Because in some sense, in order to find go-to-market fit, right, you need to be delivering a value proposition to the masses that the masses are comfortable with adopting, right? Like that seems like a definitional statement, right? Now the problem with a value proposition with a business like Airbnb, and let me be clear what I mean by when I say a business like Airbnb. The way that I'm thinking about Airbnb here is as a marketplace, right? So what is Airbnb? It's an online marketplace, which is, a web destination where two sides of the market meet, right? Right? There are sellers and there are buyers, right? The sellers are the people who want to rent their place, and the buyers are the people who want to rent someone else's place, right? So it's a two-sided market. Now the problem with a marketplace like this is that its value proposition has a peculiar aspect to it, and it touches on something that we call a chicken and egg problem, which is, think of the perspective of the buy side and the sell side here, right? Sellers only find the marketplace useful. I don't remember, did I say sellers? Sellers only find it useful if there are a lot of buyers that are already on the platform, correct? And vice versa, right? Buyers only say it's worth going if there's a bunch of options on the sell side there, right? And so in some sense, like, until you have a lot of buyers and sellers, this is not that attractive of a marketplace for people, which makes it kind of tricky to build from zero, right? Right? Like, before you build it, how do you get those first folks, or how do you get enough folks to show up? By the way, this kind of chicken and egg problem occurs for two types of businesses, actually. One type of business is a marketplace, two-sided, like Airbnb, but it also holds for network effects businesses, right? So think like social media, right? It's not like it's really two-sided. It's just like there are users on Facebook, but like Facebook is not that valuable to me if no one else is on Facebook, right? But once a lot of people are on Facebook, it's got a big pull for me, right? So the chicken and egg problem actually doesn't just hold for stuff like Airbnb. It also holds for network effects businesses as well. Now that wasn't a binding concern, it turns out, for Facebook. But that maybe is a function a little bit more of luck. They really found the right way to like progressively build their network. But even if we're talking about network effects businesses and marketplace effects businesses, I would also venture a step forward. There's a chicken and egg problem with both of them, but the problem is way, way, way bigger for a marketplace business. And it's because you don't just have a chicken and egg problem, you have a balancing problem, which is, it's really important when you're building your marketplace for you to balance the growth in the supply and demand. Because if you all of a sudden do something right, you've got like very little supply and demand, you do something great on the demand side and the demand side shoots up, but you haven't quite figured it out for the supply side, what's gonna happen? This shoots up. The people who are on this side that shot up, they're gonna be really unhappy with their experience with their product because the other side was so lacking. And so in order for you to successfully grow a marketplace business, it's not just that you have to solve a chicken and egg problem. You need to solve actually two chicken and egg problems, both sides of the marketplace, and you need to solve them at the same pace so that you preserve liquidity in the market. And that's really difficult. And so it's not a surprise that a company like Airbnb, struggled to build its marketplace. If anything, it's a testament to their ingenuity that they were able to build it. Because let me tell you another thing about online marketplaces specifically. Like, it doesn't take a genius to say the following: oh, it would be nice to have an online marketplace. There's no go-to market for this good or service online. I'm going to build it. Like, I'm not going to call you a creative genius if you do that. Okay? Right? The problem for a lot of these marketplaces, online marketplaces, is not to come up with the idea that this marketplace, once it is built, might be valuable. The real difficulty is conquering the 2 chicken and egg problems. Right? And that's actually why, I challenge you guys to the following exercise. Come up with a list of all the online marketplaces that you think could exist that would add value to both sides of the marketplace if it did exist. Because literally for pretty much every good and service, you could say this. And then go look on the internets and see how many of those categories actually have a go-to marketplace. And what you'll find is very few. Right? There are actually surprisingly few, if anything, dominant online marketplaces. Whereas there's a lot of missing ones where we think like, well, if it existed, it would clearly be great. The reason why there are these blanks where they could exist and be great, but they don't exist, because it's really tough to conquer the go-to-market fit problem here. Okay? So, by the way, I'm not going to show you how to conquer it. Let's be clear. Seriously, given what I just said, if I knew how to do it and I was just teaching it to you and not doing it myself, I'd be a fool, right? So I'm not going to show you how to conquer it, but I'm going to try to give you glimpses on things that make it challenging. Sound good? But I think it's useful to understand that huge, like the fact that network effects and especially marketplace affect businesses find this really, really challenging. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Airbnb story. Okay. So, by the way, as I'm telling you the Airbnb story, you'll start to see that, like, with Airbnb, what you call product market fit versus what you call go-to-market fit seems to be a little bit murky. And part of the reason is that the value proposition is affected by how many people you have. So the things are kind of intertwined into a web, right? That's not true for every startup, let's be clear, but it is kind of true for network effect and marketplace effect, right? So if you hear my story and you're like, man, like, I'm not sure, like, should Jira really be calling this go-to-market fit or is it kind of more product market? Like, well taken, point well taken, okay? But nonetheless, let's just do it because it's interesting as far as I'm concerned. So here's the thing that maybe a lot of folks don't realize about Airbnb because they only started paying attention once Airbnb was established, which is that, like, Airbnb launched to crickets multiple times. So I'll tell you a little bit about the launches, the failed launches that they had. They had a test launch, which they viewed as being successful. And, I think there's some truth to it, which is actually, like, the way Airbnb was created was basically accidental. I think it was all three. It's either two of the co-founders or all three of the co-founders were roommates in San Francisco. Two of them were basically people in the design industry. So Brian Chesky and this guy, I think his name is Joe Gebbia, but I might be saying it slightly wrong. And they were struggling to pay their inflated San Francisco rent. And so they decided that they wanted to find ways to make a little bit more money. And what they ended up doing is there was a major design conference that was being held in San Francisco. And they just said, look, we'll just set up a website. We'll call it Air Bed and Breakfast. And we'll just literally offer air mattresses on our floor in our apartment. And cook up breakfast for the people who come, and we'll see if anyone wants to pay us a bit of money for that service. And they, they're in the design industry, and they knew about the design conference, and they know like the places online that design people go to when they're about to go to that conference. So they went and just posted something that people who were going to that conference would notice, and they had no problem. They were able to rent very easily, a relatively short amount of time. All the space capacity that they had in their place. They rented their like living room to 3 people, right? So like, oh, that's interesting. Like, maybe we're not the only people who could use a few extra bucks and who have an underutilized living room floor. We've already built this website. Let's see what we can do with it. Right? That was the initial insight, right? It's kind of, they stumbled onto it. And so they actually decided like, hey, let's actually try to do this. In fact, like the third co-founder only formally joined kind of after they had that observation, and he was the programmer. So he was the person who was doing, things like, allowing you to make bookings online, allowing you to post your property as someone who's not internal to the company and stuff like that. Right. But they decided to build that product, like a rudimentary version of what we see as a product now. Didn't have things like payments or anything like that initially, but something where other people could go to the website, set up a listing, and then get informed when someone wanted to book. And then they decided to launch it. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given that they had launched their test around a conference, they decided initially the way we're going to build our market is around conferences, right? And their hope is we'll build it around conferences, but once we build it, it will self-sustain, right? So they did a few launches by trying to kickstart their marketplace, right, around conferences. Their first attempt was to do this around South by Southwest, which is in Austin, Texas. It's kind of like a cool person's technology/music conference or something like that. Didn't work out quite so well. They got 3 transactions for the whole conference. One of the transactions was one of the founders, was Brian Chesky. So they really only had 2. And who knows, maybe he's not telling us, but maybe one was his mom. I don't know. But this is not what we call go-to-market fit, right? So they're like, okay, well, we got to change something. And so they decide, look, we'll do this again. And they decided to pick as their next 2 conferences for launching. And they did this in kind of a unified manner because they're pretty quickly one after the other, was to launch things. This would have been in 2008, I believe, around the presidential election year in the US, to do new launches around the Democratic and Republican national conventions. And what they realized that they had kind of screwed up the first time in South by Southwest was that they didn't have a good PR-driven marketing strategy to get people who are going to the conference to be aware of their product/service. So they were like, we got to get more savvy in terms of PR. So they became more effective at like reaching out to bloggers that were, blogging on important political topics, getting, mentions in newspapers and stuff like that. Right. So they kind of became a bit more savvy in terms of getting essentially like cheap marketing, right? You can think of PR as being ideally marketing that you get without having to pay a marketer. I mean, it's a little bit more blurry than that, let's be clear, right? But that's kind of what they did with the DNC and RNC conventions. They also did some stuff that was like, I guess creative. I don't know what would be exactly the word, but like things that help them get buzz and help them get more coverage that like was definitely not scalable. So, I mean, if you go and read on the Airbnb story, or if you look at YouTube videos, one thing that you'll often see the founders talk about is how they helped generate buzz around their product and service by selling cereal boxes that had a political theme around the DNC and the RNC. So like for the DNC, right, the political candidate was Obama, right? They took Cheerios. They took Cheerios and they made a different version of a Cheerios box called Obama O's. And then they literally went and bought like hundreds of Cheerios things and just moved the Cheerios from the regular Cheerios box to their Obama O's box. And I think for like John McCain, who was the RNC candidate, they did like, like I guess there's Captain Crunch. They did a theme on that with like Captain McCain or something. It sounds kind of nuts, right? Because you're like, wait a second, like this, it seems like you kind of are wasting your time, right? And it certainly doesn't sound like it's core for go-to-market, but they realized they had to do whatever the hell they could do to just try to kickstart some liquidity because of the chicken and egg problem. So they were viewing this as like, okay, like maybe this will help us hack our way to a bit of a jolt of coverage on our product, and it's going to get us some liquidity, and then it's going that liquidity is going to, like a flywheel, kind of persist and maybe even grow, right? And by the way, what they did there with, believe it or not, with that cereal stuff, it actually helped them. It actually helped them in two ways. They apparently made like $40,000 selling those cereal boxes, which for them was a little bit like a funding round because no VC wanted to invest in them at this point. So that actually helped them. It actually did help them get meaningful transactions, especially, I guess, with the DNC convention. It was more successful than with the RNC. So I don't know what that says about Republicans versus Democrats and the ability to indulge in a joke, but there was some elements of success with that weird thing that they did. The thing is, it didn't solve the go-to-market fit problem for them. The reason why it didn't solve the go-to-market fit problem is, even with the DNC, they got a spike in, I think the DNC was held in Denver. I could be wrong. They got a spike of transactions in Denver. The problem is it was a temporary spike because the flow of transactions was basically entirely predicated on the fact that there was just a huge but temporary jolt in demand for renting space around the DNC, specifically in Denver. But once that jolt in demand pulled away, they were no longer particularly useful, right? And like someone might have been interested in renting a spot on their living room floor if someone is so desperate that they're willing to pay $400 for it, right? But once you get to normal demand, when demand goes down, price goes down, right? Holding supply fixed. But all of a sudden now someone is like, no, I'll only do it for $20. And then you're like, do I want a stranger sleeping on for $20? Maybe not, right? So what they had kind of worked, but it was kind of like reverse icicles. It was little spikes that quickly fell down, right? So that it wasn't self-sustaining liquidity in the marketplace. And that's a problem, because then if they wanted to build a business out of that, they would have to become like these traveling salespeople that are going from like city to city where the various conferences are. Like, if that sounds like a lot of work and pretty expensive, you're absolutely right. It's quite expensive to do that. And every conference is different. So it's not like you solve the same problem over and over again, right? And so that wasn't scalable. So there was some good things to say. There was some funny anecdotes to bring up from that, but it was still a failed launch. It was, though, a failed launch that made them realize their strategy around conferences was a dead end, which was an important learning, by the way, because that meant if they kept trying to do things around conferences going forward, they would never make it. Right? And so, actually, by the way, this is one of the things I'm going to say, that almost every investor who knows the founders of Airbnb that I've spoken to, they pretty much universally say the same thing. They emphasize just how how amazing, especially Brian Chesky, who's the main founder / CEO, how amazing that person was at learning from very little data on how things needed to be changed to help with go to market, right? And to help with like building, things like community and stuff like that. So I like to watch Brian Chesky YouTube videos periodically, mainly just to try to get a sense of what do you see that's different about how this person communicates versus others, other typical founders, and what does that tell me about the ability to learn about those things that are super unstructured learning. And if I kind of start to get a feel for that, maybe I'll be better at identifying the most talented founders. And if I want to be an investor, that's a really good skill for me to have, right? So like sometimes I watch founder videos, founder interviews, founder presentations, like not so much for what they're saying, but for trying to understand them as opposed to their presentation, right? But in any case, going back to the main point, so we're definitely going to go over 20 minutes here, my bad. Like a big thing that the founders of Airbnb learned was actually a pretty fundamental point about go-to-market strategy for marketplaces, which is actually for a lot of marketplaces, the challenge in getting go-to-market fit can be like the blame for that can be attributed to one side of the market. So oftentimes it's much more difficult to build up one side of of the supply demand market, right? But for different businesses or for different marketplaces, the pain point might be the supply side or the demand side. Airbnb, the demand side was actually not that big of a problem because people would be happy to rent someone else's home if it could be materially cheaper than a hotel. Like people were generally okay with taking the risk that something might not look as good as the pictures, especially if the pictures didn't necessarily look great to begin with anyway, right? But people are very worried about letting a stranger sleep in their house, right? So the supply side was like hella tough to conquer. So they knew they had to like, you got a chicken and egg problem, and you got this notion of putting all your egg in a basket, but the egg here is different from the egg there. Like they put all their eggs in like, we need to build supply side, and they can't build supply side everywhere. So what they did do is they went to the one region where they had gotten a little bit more than crickets as traction in their marketplace, which was specifically New York City. And they did this while they were in the Y Combinator accelerator program. If you remember when I talked about the definition of a startup, the first component of the definition that I said was a quote by the founder of Y Combinator, Paul Graham, right? So they were in that accelerator program at the time. The program was just in San Francisco. And this was actually a reaction to advice they got from Paul Graham, which is Paul basically said, guys, you guys only have a bit of traction in New York City. Get your ass to New York City and figure out how to build something there, because you can't build it everywhere at once. Your time is not best spent in San Francisco, even though you're in our program. So they did that. They literally moved themselves to New York City, and they did everything they could to build a bit of traction there. And in particular, I think I've already even discussed this earlier. They literally went door to door in New York City in the neighborhoods where they did have some listings, and basically helped, encourage other people to list by literally knock on door. Hey, how's it going? Let us tell you about this, blah, blah, blah. Do you want us to help you with the listing? We will take pictures for you. We will enter it for you. And let's see what happens. They did that in New York City. And that helped them get a bit of liquidity traction in that city. So what did that do? that was actually critical for helping them build their marketplace, but it did not get them to ready for go-to-market fit. Actually, I would say if I wanted to kind of use my labels, which I probably should, given that that's what I've taught you guys, I would say that that's what got them product market fit. Because they established that, like, if we can build liquidity in an area, it actually works. The problem is that they had done it with things that don't scale, because they couldn't go door to door everywhere in the world, right? So they had to find another way, right? So, right, because the whole point with go-to-market fit is you find a customer acquisition strategy that is scalable. It's pretty difficult to scale the door-to-door stuff. So what else did they do? So probably the most important thing that they did that did help, that was scalable in terms of customer acquisition, is they decided to basically, and it was about being able to automate something, is they actually went and, maybe I'll put it a different way because it's a more general statement. They said, look, we want to get supply of housing where you kind of rent to strangers. What are places on the web where you can go find a digital transaction of this sort? And then they were like, Craigslist, right? Because Craigslist already existed at that time. And Craigslist was letting people post, room to rent, home to rent, apartment to rent. And so what did they do? So, this guy right here, Nathan, wrote basically a little computer program that would automate the following process. Go to all the Craigslist postings for real estate. Send a message response through Craigslist to that posting and tell them about Airbnb. And give them a button that they can click that will actually make it super easy for them to convert their Craigslist posting into an Airbnb posting. They actually also did it in a slightly sketchier way than that because the bot, I'm not sure exactly how much in detail I should go into this thing, but like the bot would like pretend to be an actual human being that was not Airbnb. And it was pretending to be female. I don't know why that, apparently that they believe that would make a difference. And be like, oh, I love your property. And I don't know. I'm not even sure if this is inappropriate for me to say it that way. I don't know. But in any case, they basically like wrote it as kind of a bullshit message that was meant to just kind of like trick the person to post on Airbnb. So you can read a little bit about that in the blog posting as well, right? So there was actually kind of some sketchy elements to it, actually. And in fact, because of it, they don't talk about it much anymore. But the basic idea is they took a pool of leads that already existed on the internet, Craigslist, and they found a way to, at a super low cost, right, siphon as many of those leads as possible, right? And by the way, even though most people who received that email did not post on Craigslist, there were so many did not post on Airbnb. There were so many, there was so much supply on Craigslist that even like a 5% success rate had a dramatic impact on the supply for Airbnb. And you actually see this in the data. If you look at data on the number of listings on their marketplace and track when there's evidence that they started the Craigslist thing, that's when you see a dramatic regime change in the rate at which they're adding listings. And by the way, like they were doing this was against Craigslist rules, right? Craigslist has a user policy that says you cannot spam emails. You cannot do bot related stuff. But, Craigslist is not able to, there isn't a computer code that you can put in that completely disables the ability to do that. So they did it anyway, right? So, setting the morality of this whole thing to the side, one way that I think about it is they basically came up with a hack to get a bunch of free leads. And that for them was super essential because that was the only way that they were going to be able to kickstart the supply side of liquidity in their marketplace. When they had a bunch of supply, getting the demand was easy for them. Was much easier. They still had to do some optimization there. And they did a bunch of A/B testing that's similar to the A/B testing that I had described with Dropbox last lecture, right? So there's actually a lot of dimensions in which they were optimizing for go-to-market fit. But to me, like a really, really big thing was this growth hack that they had for getting a bunch of supply through Craigslist, right? And notice, like, that's a situation-specific solution, right? This is not a formula type solution, like take money, throw to Facebook, right? No, this is like something where like you kind of have to be a bit creative to spot that, right? And in fact, you know, that's why, like, you've probably heard the term growth hacking. This is what growth hacking is. It's finding these clever ways to overcome things like network effects problem, you know, two-sided marketplace, chicken and egg problems as well, right? To basically find a way to jolt the value proposition when it's embedded within your growth proposition, right? And in fact, kind of consistent with this, there are like a set of people who have developed a reputation in, for instance, Silicon Valley as being very competent and creative growth hackers. And, you know, I'll give you one example. Sean Ellis, Sean, S-E-A-N, L-S-E-L-L-I-S, right? So he's probably best known as having led growth at Dropbox, I believe. He was gone from Dropbox when I started following Dropbox more seriously. But the thing that's interesting about these growth hackers is you actually find that they move from one phase 2 startup to another over time. And the reason is they have a pretty unique skill set that's particularly valuable to the startups that are in this phase of the startup life cycle.
On that note, if I can jump in here really quick, like, why do you see, like, you see these growth hacks, and obviously, like you said, Craigslist was not like okay with them doing this, but didn't really have much ability to stop it. Why don't you ever see like legal action brought against these startups? Whereas like if a major company did this, like for sure they'd be going to court.
There are lawsuits. And in fact, I think I might have mentioned that like the first business hire / CFO of Dropbox was a friend of mine from college. One of my friends from grad school is a pretty prominent entrepreneur / angel investor. He founded a company called 3Taps. 3Taps, T-A-P-S. What 3Taps did is it mined Craigslist along with all sorts of other sources for real estate listings online. And it basically provided an API that would allow people to put all the listings from all these different sources onto a map. I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of a company called PadMapper. It may be a little bit older than some of you guys. But PadMapper used 3Taps to put listings on their maps, right? So 3Taps had been developed by this person that was a housemate of mine my first year of grad school. His name is Greg Kidd, G-R-E-G, Kidd, K-I-D-D. You guys actually should Google him. He's probably one of the most prominent angel investors in fintech in the world. He was a part of the founding executive team of Ripple as in the digital currency XRP. And in January 2018, the Ripple he owned was worth $1.5 billion. In any case, it's a pretty visionary guy. But yeah, so he developed a product that was basically aggregating a bunch of information from places like Craigslist. And there was a lawsuit that was viewed as extremely important in Silicon Valley. That was the Craigslist versus 3Taps lawsuit. It's sufficiently important that I think it has its own Wikipedia page. Craigslist sued him I'm not joking, for more than $1 trillion. Which, you know, if you have cryptocurrency worth 1.5 billion, you're happy until you're worried that you might lose $1 trillion. But yeah, no, like Craigslist has tried to chop this through the legal channel in all sorts of different ways. And I won't go into the details of that lawsuit. It ended up getting settled. It did cost my former housemate, I think he told me it was like $15 to $20 million for the settlement and the legal fees, right? So like, yes, Craigslist has some ability to secure their, but it is actually still an open legal question as to whether even Craigslist is allowed to say you're not allowed to use this. Because the thing is, you can get to all of those links through Google search. So if Google search is allowed to do it, why shouldn't others be allowed to do it? That's actually a legal question that is still not answered, because a lot of like really expensive lawsuits get settled rather than, you know, seen to fruition. But I think like recently LinkedIn has sued another startup that was mining a bunch of data from LinkedIn. And so this is like version 2.0 of the Craigslist 3-taps lawsuit, right? But until one of those lawsuits actually becomes case law, it's still an open legal question. But no doubt, and it shouldn't be surprising to any of us, like Craigslist holds this really valuable asset, and if everyone can siphon it, it's less valuable, so they want to protect the shit out of it, right? So yeah, absolutely, you're 100% correct, and it's a little bit random that I actually have some personal connection to some of that discussion, but yeah, I mean, Craigslist definitely tried, and that's actually one of the reasons why, like, it's tougher for other companies to use Craigslist as a hack right now, because they're much more reactive to it, because this really bit them in the you-know-what. Like, Craigslist lost a lot because Airbnb was able to kickstart their marketplace with this, right? Craigslist would be much happier if Airbnb did not exist, right? We would not be happier, but Craigslist would be. But you know, that, by the way, that's the nature of growth hacks. Sometimes some growth hacks, at their essence, they're exploit the vulnerability of someone else to your benefit, right? You know, whether it's the right thing to do, whether it's the legal thing to do. Oftentimes on the legal thing, it's a murky area. A lot of startups travel, you know, in territory that seems at least somewhat sketchy. Like, Airbnb is not the only one to do that.
It just seems like there's a huge disincentive, because if it fails, like Craigslist probably not going to even know, because there's not going to be a big fuss about, you know, big growth of some startup. But if it wins, you know, this guy's sitting on $1.5 billion, and basically a slap on the wrist is a $15 million or $20 million cost, right? Like in the context.
Yeah, but a lot of startup founders aren't lucky to have $1.5 billion of crypto. So for most startup founders, a lawsuit from Craigslist too early kills them. And so actually, part of the secret with a growth hack of this type, exploit the vulnerability of someone else, right? Is oftentimes its success is predicated on exploiting in a way that you don't get detected quickly, which might be one of the reasons why they wanted to pretend to be an actual human being, right? As opposed to, you know, a mega nerd when they were doing that, right? But, you know, some of this is speculative on my end, right? Okie doke. I mean, that's basically what I wanted to say about the Airbnb story. Now I'm going to just end things off with just 2 more examples. I already prefaced this before, which is that, you know, what I said about Craigslist, it was really about marketing strategy and marketing tactics, right? And what I want to say is search for go-to-market fit is not pure marketing, sales, strategy, tactics. It's also still about product, right? Because at the end of the day, you only want to start scaling aggressively if the money you pay to acquire new customers is more than offset by the value you get from them in the future, right? So if you think of the money you spend to get them is the cost, and the value you get in the future is the benefit, you want B to be bigger than C, right? A lot of marketing tactics, sales tactics, stuff like that, it's about lowering C, making it cheaper and cheaper for you to acquire a customer. But another way for you to make the economics work is for you to make B bigger and bigger. And usually the best way to make B bigger is to have a more valuable product, i.e. have a better product or have a wider stream of product lines that the customers want, right? So product expansion and product improvement. So you should be looking at this stage to achieve some measure of success on both of those dimensions if you can. And so I just want to give one example of each, okay? So first example I'm going to give is an example of product improvement at PayPal, right? So I'll assume people know what PayPal is. It really is kind of a central company to e-commerce at this stage, right? PayPal was a company that actually found it relatively easy to get users. So their problem wasn't, if we think cost of getting a user and then benefit of getting a user, their problem wasn't so much the cost of getting a user. They had actually a big problem with B, the benefit of a user. Now, when we think the benefit of a user, it's once you have a user, what's the benefit that you get from charging something to them minus what's the cost that you have to pay to service them, right? And they had one enormous problem with the cost, and that was fraudulent transactions. They were getting a lot of like fraudulent accounts that would basically try to scam them. Now, any individual attempt at scamming them was highly unlikely to succeed. The problem is PayPal is doing payment transactions online, which is basically involving a computer, which means someone can write a bot that will do 1 million attempts at virtually no cost. So, you know what? If I have a 1% chance of success, if I can only do it once a day, then I'll be like, thanks, but no thanks. But if I can do it 1 trillion times a day, I'm going to be like, woohoo, right? That's why you still get those emails from the prince of somewhere, right? Saying like, hey, you know, my uncle just passed away and wants to send me $1 billion. I'll let you keep 5 million of it. It's because they can send this to, like, it's not because all of us are fools, right? Same thing with these, right? Well, the moment you move things to digital, the cost of an attempt is really low unless you find a way to block it. That was the product improvement that PayPal made. They found a way to make it more difficult for those fraudsters to like keep tossing fraudulent attempts at them. And their solution was something called CAPTCHA, right? CAPTCHA. I think now, if you guys have definitely seen it, if you've ever done any purchasing transactions on the internet, now it may be called reCAPTCHA, right? But what was it? Is like, you know, show me an image with like some scribbles of letters and numbers with all sorts of weird, you know, slashes on it and stuff, so that it actually becomes very difficult to have a computer vision algorithm that will figure out what those letters and number sequences are, but that any human looking at it will be able to do it. What that does is it kills the ability to write a program to automate everything. There needs to be a human touch for every attempt, which means we start moving towards doing not 1 trillion attempts, but like, let's say it takes 1 minute per attempt for a human. Well, now one fraudster can only do, you know, a much smaller amount of fraudulent attempts now. And that dramatically lowers the cost of the service. Make sense? Like, to me, that was a fabulous example of really understanding where the problems in your economics lie and making a change to improve your customer acquisition economics. So to me, great example. Again, that's why I have it here. The person who came up with this algorithm for slowing down fraud is someone called Max Levchkin or something like that. Max, M-A-X, the standard way. Levchkin, I think it's L-E-V-C-H-K-I-N, I think. It's a sufficiently unusual family name that I might have spelled it slightly wrong. So he's also now the founder of a very prominent other fintech company that's probably going to go public in the next year. I'm just forgetting its name right now. Apologies. So I forgot his name and the name of his high-flying company. So now let's give another example. By the way, I just building on the fact that I shared you guys a list of my go-to sources for like learning about stuff. There's groups of people that I track as well, and I'm not the only person to do it. But like the team of core folks at PayPal are folks that I pay attention to. But just for you to get a sense of who those folks were: Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, David Sachs, who's multiple time. Did I post? I definitely posted him because he has a blog. So I posted his blog among the operators that I track. Max Levchkin, one of the founders of YouTube, was a PayPal person as well. Like literally, it's incredible how many people from PayPal have continued to have a real impact on the startup ecosystem after PayPal. That's why actually I'm not the only one who keeps track of it. And so many people keep track of the PayPal folks that the PayPal folks have been given a name for their posse, which is the PayPal Mafia. So, useful to know. It gives you, knowing who to track is kind of helpful for helping you save time to keep up to date on stuff, right? But now let's talk about an example of product expansion, right? So with product expansion, right, the idea is you're growing your B by being able to monetize more, right? Essentially upselling to your existing customers, right? That obviously makes the benefit of having the customer bigger, right? And sometimes the product expansion is about making more money from the target customer that you're currently targeting. And sometimes it's a product expansion that's about making your product attractive to a new set of target customers, maybe who are more economical for you, right? And so in the context of a product expansion, I'm going to give an example of the second type, right? Where your product expansion is about now giving you access to a new clientele where that clientele is more valuable. And the example I'll do is Square. I know a reasonable amount of Square as well because the person that I had mentioned that was my housemate and who got sued for $1 trillion, he was also the main mentor of Jack Dorsey, who's the founder of Twitter and Square. I'm not going to do this in the context of class, but if anyone's interested in the backstory on that stuff, it's actually pretty interesting. But basically, he was an angel, and he ended up also being an angel investor in Twitter and Square. So he's tracked both companies right from the beginning. But so with Square, right? So with Square, it was actually like they got product market fit for a very specific clientele, which is micro vendors, right? So these are think of like people who sell at a farmer's market, so that the amount of business they do is so small that it just doesn't justify, going through all the effort to being set up as a merchant with credit card companies so that you can accept credit card payments. Because actually, in order to be able to directly accept, Visa, MasterCard, Amex transactions, like you actually need to go through like a quality verification process where you prove that you're not a fraudster, for instance, among other things, right? And that actually takes time. And then getting all the equipment to be able to accept credit cards, that takes money as well. So it only makes sense for you to do it if you're a large enough vendor. And so like Jack Dorsey, initially his insight was like, look, with a smartphone, we can now enable these folks from a hardware perspective to be able to accept credit card payments, so long as we add this extra dongle that's going to be able to read the credit card, right? And we can bypass the whole account verification process of like a Visa or a MasterCard by setting up something called a merchant aggregator model. What is a merchant aggregator model? Square set up their account with Visa and MasterCard. And then what they do is they're essentially lending their account to everyone else. And all they have to do is keep track of everything. So they send everything to the right folks. So that this money that came in, it came from, Mike, and this other one came from Louis, and you need to make sure that it doesn't all get gumbled up together, right? So you need to be good at managing that database. But that was their idea, and that offered that was like an easy sell to micro vendors. They were like, "Oh, that's awesome! Sure, I'll do it." Right? Now I can accept credit card payments. I don't lose transactions because people don't have cash, right? So that's how they reached product market fit. Now the problem with the micro vendors is the vendors validated the value proposition, but they weren't that valuable, and they were actually tough to find, because it's not like you can go onto Yelp and search every single, micro vendor of food. So actually finding those micro vendors is pretty difficult. It's labor intensive. It's not scalable. And compounding that problem, those folks don't sell too much, so you won't get that much from payment transactions from them. So they're both expensive to get and offer cheap return by their definition of being micro and scattered all over the place. And that's a pretty fundamental problem for search to go to market fit, right? So Square knew that was not the, touchdown line for them, right? Like they had to throw the ball somewhere else, right? And so they're like, look, we have to go up the size of customer chain. And if we go to like more traditional brick and mortar enterprise that already use credit card are already plugged into the credit card network, if we can somehow get them to choose to use us instead of using the direct to MasterCard or Visa type thing, then maybe we're onto something. And so then they thought, well, how can we do that? How can we convince brick and mortar to do this? And they're like, well, why don't we offer a more holistic point of sale system for them, right? Especially like the iPad has come out now, right? We can create a nice, you guys have seen the Square stuff when you go, get a haircut or something like that, right? They make it look nice, and they have software that like ups the level relative to just this little credit card swipe reader thing, right? Because they've got some data management in the background that can help with inventory management, or help with some basic analytics that can help the small business person, figure out like what is good, what is not good, and on what days, right? So they were able to augment their system with additional product, right, to make it even more valuable to their new target customer. And their new target customer was easier to find because they show up in business directories, right? And was also more valuable because they just do more payment transaction because they're a more serious, larger business. And that was the product expansion that Square did in order to make their unit economics, which I've posted a video for, right? The analytical financy part of this phase 2, which is when you validate that you're ready to move, beyond search for go-to-market fit and start scaling aggressively. For them, that was critical for achieving that. Any questions about this? No? Okay, well, I mean, that pretty much, again, this wraps up all of our qualitative discussion of search for go-to-market fit. And again, just to reiterate, I have posted on my courses already a video where I talk about the quantitative component of this phase of the startup lifecycle, which is study customer acquisition as an NPV problem, also known as unit economics in terms of practitioner lingo in the real world. So, you guys can go watch that video, maybe at some point we can have some Q&A related to unit economics specifically. Sound good? All right. So what we're going to do next week, our next week, I think we've got a blended week where the first session is live and the second session is recorded. I think my memory might be wrong, but so first session, we're going to do phase 3 of the startup life cycle and talking about the process of exit. And then the second lecture is going to talk about VC firms and VC funds and thinking about evaluating the performance of VC funds. Evaluating the performance of VC funds has some slightly technical aspects that are very different from what you might have seen in other finance courses for, say, evaluating a hedge fund or a mutual fund. Like if you've taken investment management, you probably discussed this. If you haven't, you have not. If you have not done investment management, don't be worried because I'm not requiring you to know that knowledge up front, right? But that's a little bit more technical. I'm going to be doing some stuff on the board. So that's going to be done Thursday, recorded session, not live, but Tuesday session is live where we're going to be, doing that third stage of the life cycle and talking about exit. Sound good? Okie dokie. Talk about a customer acquisition strategy. We generally think of a specific customer acquisition funnel, right? And again, when a startup is navigating phase 2 of the life cycle, they're oftentimes testing more than one customer acquisition strategy. So, so what I'm going to be describing here, generally, we want to try to identify the attractiveness of different customer acquisition funnels separately. So I'm going to describe, the analytics around valuing a specific customer acquisition funnel. But one thing you want to be careful about when you want to do this kind of valuation-based analytics is that you want to separate out the, your different customer acquisition strategies so that you can separately gauge the effectiveness of your different custom go-to-market strategies, right? So you might be ready to scale one specific customer acquisition strategy, but not the other. So, so what I'm describing here, you want to think about identifying and mapping out this funnel for each of the different customer acquisition strategies that you use. So that would be kind of, different marketing channels, even potentially different vendors that you'll acquire leads from, so on and so forth. So at the individual customer acquisition funnel, you want to do this type of analysis to figure out whether that specific funnel is attractive to scale or not. And when we think about a customer acquisition funnel, we generally think of, in some sense, transition probabilities, where you start with acquiring a potential lead that could become a paid customer at some point. And then, depending on your sales and marketing process, there might be a transition phase where you go from an acquired lead to an activated or qualified lead, right? Because maybe not all leads that you receive are created equal. Before a lead becomes a customer, there might be a requirement for you to make additional investments, right? So maybe a sales call or a site visit to a specific company to convince them to adopt your product. And so you might want to go through a qualification or activation process in the customer acquisition funnel to kind of economize on those costs. So, when we're mapping out a customer acquisition funnel, we want to find out, well, once we acquire a lead, how expensive is it to get this initial lead, right? How likely is it that this lead eventually becomes positively qualified? How expensive is the qualification process? Then what's the likelihood that this qualified lead maybe eventually becomes a customer? And within a customer acquisition, you want to keep track of the different types of customers that you might be acquiring. So you might have a basic customer and a premium customer. You want to separately identify the probabilities of each of these different customers in terms of what the likelihood that a paid lead would eventually become one of these various different types of valued customers. And once you have customer acquisition, then you want to figure out, well, what is the value of each of your different tiers of customers? And with kind of modern startups, Generally, this involves a forecasting exercise where you want to figure out, well, what is going to be the value of your customer in the long term in terms of that customer's potential to generate recurring revenue for your company. So you're going to want to, within your customer acquisition funnel, also keep track of customer engagement and retention, the possibility that in the future, if you've got multiple tiers of a product, that a customer might upgrade from a lower tiered version of a product to a more valuable tier. And you also want to think about the possibility of customer referral, right? Because if a particular customer refers a lot of additional leads to your business, well, that makes that customer more valuable. So when you're trying to figure out, well, what's the value of a specific lead, you also want to think about, well, what's the value of the possibility that this lead eventually refers additional leads to you. So when we think about kind of forecasting out what the costs and benefits associated with a specific customer acquisition funnel are, we're going to be trying to map out the implications of all of these steps of the customer acquisition funnel. And I think the easiest way to gain some comfort with this procedure is actually to think about mapping out this customer acquisition funnel in a specific example. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm first going to describe a specific customer acquisition funnel via example, and we'll look at the implications of that customer acquisition funnel on the expected costs and benefits that are associated with that customer acquisition funnel. And then once we've done that, then we'll discuss how we can go from that forecast of cost and benefits to pinning down a net value today of any given lead that comes to the company through that go-to-market strategy. So let's do this via example here. So we'll be building towards a valuation analysis of a customer acquisition funnel. But first, what I'll do is I'll describe a specific funnel. And one thing that you guys want to recognize is that different examples of go-to-market strategies for different startups are going to have slightly different nuances in what the customer acquisition funnel looks like. So I'm going to give you one example here. I'm also tomorrow going to post a homework problem on unit economics, which is going to involve a slightly more complex version of a customer acquisition funnel. And so that'll be meant to highlight the heterogeneity that we can see in practice in these customer acquisition funnels and how that impacts our analysis of the costs and benefits associated with that funnel and eventually the value of that funnel. So let's start with a startup called Share LaTeX. For our purposes, we're going to think of it as a SaaS startup, software as a service. And that startup currently offers two versions of its product. So we're going to be doing our analysis here where we're going to be mapping out a funnel where there are two types of customers you can acquire. So this is a startup with a freemium business model. So they're going to have one version of their product that's cheaper to provide, but that doesn't generate revenue. So they're going to have a free version of the product. Free version of the product doesn't generate any revenue, but involves some costs associated with servicing those customers. We're going to assume that the cost every year is $5 per year to service free customers. We'll also have a paid tier to our customer base, and paid customers are going to pay $120 per year for use of the SaaS product, and servicing those paid customers because, for instance, in this case, the paid version of the product doesn't have a document limit. whereas the free version of the product is a more parsed down version of the product that limits how many documents you can edit with this specific processor, word processor. So we'll assume that the cost of servicing a paid customer is $20 per year. So again, one of the things that I said is at this stage in our analysis of a customer acquisition funnel, we're going to assume that we know all of these key parameters in the customer acquisition funnel, right? So how much money do we make from a paid customer? How much does it cost to service that customer, so on and so forth. We're going to, and what the likelihood that a lead eventually becomes a paid customer. We're going to assume that we know all of those parameters, and we're going to focus just on the mechanics of doing a valuation analysis of this customer acquisition funnel. And at the end of the course, we'll talk about how we can go about estimating each of these parameters in practice, and what some of the hazards and common mistakes that that startups and investors can make in estimating these funnel parameters that occur in practice. I'm going to assume for the purposes of our exercise that all of these revenues and costs are paid at the end of a year. So that means if we acquire a paid customer today, the paid customer doesn't pay us anything right now. They pay us $120 at the end of the year. And the $20 that we paid, that we have as a marginal cost of servicing that customer is also going to be paid at the end of the year. That's just done out of convenience. We can solve these valuation problems in the analysis of unit economics using any combination of assumptions on the precise timing of both these revenues and costs. Now, one thing I'll point out when we do this type of analysis of a customer acquisition funnel is that you'll notice we are only focusing on the marginal benefits and marginal costs associated with a customer lead acquired in this funnel. So there's a lot of things that would be relevant if we wanted to answer a different question, which is what is the value of the startup, right? So when we're analyzing a startup, we can ask ourselves, well, what's the value of a particular customer acquisition strategy or a paid lead? But we could also ask a broader question, which is what is the overall value of this startup, which is also another valuation problem. In order to solve the latter question, valuation of a startup, we need to know a lot more information than what we'll need to know in order to solve for the value of a lead. Because to value an overall startup, if you wanted to do this from bottom-up fundamentals, you would need to know all the information that you need to know for value of a lead, but you would also need to know additional information. Because in order to value the startup, it wouldn't be sufficient just to know whether a lead is profitable or not. You'd need to forecast, well, how many leads are you going to be acquiring every period? So what is going to be your customer acquisition? Like, what is going to be the volume of your customer acquisition over time? And in addition to that, you need to measure a wide array of different fixed costs associated with running a startup, right? So you would have to value the startup from a kind of bottom-up discounted cash flow perspective. You would need to estimate the fixed costs associated with a startup. You would also need to estimate what the expected capital expenditures associated with the startup are. So there's a lot of things you need to analyze and forecast when you're valuing an entire startup that you don't need to analyze when you're just trying to assess this narrower question of are you acquiring customers profitably, and is that strategy ready to scale? And in fact, that's one of the reasons why this type of valuation analysis within a startup tends to be done at the unit economics level, so at the customer acquisition level first, before we use similar valuation techniques to value an entire startup. So we'll, again, this is something that I'm going to be discussing in a bit more detail in weeks 3 and 4 when we talk about the valuation of startups. but there's a practical justification for why we're focusing on applying our valuation toolkit to the value of a lead first. It's because it's a simpler problem to solve. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue describing some additional aspects of this customer acquisition funnel. So I'm going to assume, so the particular go-to-market strategy that we're analyzing for Share LaTeX right now is a strategy for acquiring customers that's based around search engine marketing. And we're going to assume that this customer acquisition strategy generates, for each lead that this customer acquisition funnel generates, we have to pay $2 per lead. And I'll assume that this specific cost, which is a component of customer acquisition cost, is paid immediately. So while the other costs and benefits that I described earlier are paid at the end of the year, this cost is going to be paid immediately. So at time 0. In addition to that, when we're analyzing a funnel, we need to have an assessment of how a funnel how a lead transitions from being a lead to being, all the various types of customers that these leads can eventually convert to. So we're going to assume in this specific example that out of the leads that we pay $2 per lead for, 10% of those leads are going to result in signups to the free version of the product. And out of that 10%, 20% of those are going to quickly convert to paid accounts. What that effectively means is 90% of leads that we pay $2 for are going to result in nothing in terms of being a customer down the road, so generate no value. And out of the remaining 10%, 2% of that, so 20% of the 10%, becomes a paid customer, and the remaining 8% becomes a free customer. I'm also going to assume that 30% of paid accounts cancel each year. So let's say today a lead becomes a paid customer. The likelihood that in year 2, this customer is still a customer would be 70%. And so what that means is we expect to receive, when a customer becomes a paid customer, we expect to receive $120 from that customer with probability 1 in the first period, so at time 1, where time is measured in years. But we would only get this $120 and relatedly pay the $20 to service that customer with a 70% probability after 2 years. I'm going to assume that this that the probability that a paid account cancels in a given year is 30% every year, so that the probability of dropping out kind of compounds over time. So what that means is in the second year, 70% of paid customers would be paid customers, but in the third year, it would be 49%, which is 70% times 70%, because out of the 70% that didn't drop in the prior year, 30% of those would drop the following year. We can make different assumptions here in terms of whether the churn rate associated with different types of customers changes over time. So maybe we would expect more cancellations in the first year than in the second year, because if you stick for a second year, you're more likely to become a sticky customer. So there's a lot of flexibility when we undertake this analysis in the assumptions we make related to our ability to retain customers over time. But I'm just going to analyze the funnel in this specific case where this rate of customers dropping stays constant every year. As I'm sure you guys are aware, the common terminology for percentage of paid users that drop in a given period is called a churn rate. I'm going to assume in this simpler example that there are no product upgrades. So really, we just have 2 versions of the product. We have the free version of the product and the paid version of the product. For now, I'm going to assume there's no referrals in this customer acquisition funnel, but I'm going to analyze this funnel twice when we do our unit economic analysis. And so in our second analysis, I'm going to incorporate the possibility of referrals in customer acquisition. So I'm going to defer to this aspect of customer acquisition to a little bit later, because this introduces an additional complication in our analysis of the value of this customer acquisition funnel. So for now, we're going to be ignoring this, and we're just going to be mapping out our funnel, assuming that neither free customers nor paid customers generate any referrals in the future. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to analyze this funnel from a cost and benefit standpoint, and then we'll discuss how we can use basic kind of finance valuation techniques, in particular net present value, to figure out what the value of customer acquisition in this funnel is. So I'm just going to switch from my slides to a whiteboard where I'm going to be working through this analysis in real time. So just give me 1 second. I'm going to stop the sharing of this screen and move to sharing a different screen. Just give me a second. I'm trying to figure out how to. All right, perfect. Can everyone see basically a digital whiteboard on the shared screen right now? Yeah. Okay. So I see a bunch of yeses. So I assume that this is viewable right now. So what we're going to be doing right now is we're just basically going to be analyzing the customer acquisition funnel that I just described. And in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to forecast what the expected current and future costs and benefits associated with acquiring one paid lead through this customer acquisition funnel is, right? So what we're basically doing is we're building towards a unit economic analysis. So we're going to be doing unit economic analysis. And what this is effectively going to do is it's going to determine whether or not and to what extent acquiring paid leads in a specific customer acquisition funnel adds value to the startup. And if this adds sufficient value, that means you want to basically try to acquire as many leads as you can through this customer acquisition funnel. And if it doesn't, then you want to continue making adjustments to your customer acquisition funnel to improve these lead level economics. In order to do this analysis, the first thing we want to do is carefully understand our customer acquisition funnel. And so that's what we basically want to go from this kind of verbal description of our funnel to forecasts of the costs and benefits, the marginal costs and benefits associated with a lead, right? So I like to kind of visually represent this as follows. So I'm going to keep track of time. So time 0, time 1, time 2, time 3, so on and so forth. So time here is measured in years. And in our specific customer acquisition funnel, when we buy a lead at time 0, we have to pay $2 for this lead, right? And for every lead that we purchase through this particular go-to-market strategy, we know that 3 things can happen, right? We can either get a paid customer or we can get a free customer, where free means free from the perspective of the customer, not you, or we can get no customer, right? And this happens, as we said, with 2% probability, because you only get a paid customer if you have the 10% transition to free and then 20% of that converting into paid customers. 8% of the time you have a free customer, and then 90% of the time you have no customer. And now what we're going to do is we're going to map out the follow-on cost and benefit implications of our different customer types, right? So as we said, with a paid customer, what would we get as a payment at, or as a net benefit 1 year from now? Well, as we said, every paid customer costs us generates revenue of $120, but we have to pay $20 in extra costs to service this customer. So we know with a paid customer that 2% of the time we would receive $100 at time 1, right? And out of that 2%, well, 70% of the time thereafter, we would receive 100 the next period, 20 at time 3, 49% of the time, which is 2 rounds of 30% churn of customers, we would get $100 at time 3. So we can see from these paid customers, right, what we expect to get on average is 100% of the time we get $100 at time 1. But then the expected cash flows associated with that customer would change over time, and in particular would exhibit a negative growth rate of minus 30%. What about free customers? I think I forgot to mention this as I was describing, but we're going to assume that none of our free accounts cancel. So in some sense, if you're a free customer, since you're not paying for the product, we'll assume that you never stop using the product. So what that means is, with a free customer, what would be the cost and benefit implications? Well, a free customer would generate no revenue, but would cost $5, right? So giving us minus 5. And then we would get minus 5 in perpetuity thereafter, because there's no negative growth rate, because these kind of, in some sense, value destroying customers, because they only generate negative value, don't churn at all. So we can assume different churn rates for different types of customers, and that's something that we generally want to measure in practice. And then with no customer, we would have zero cash flows forever into the future. So this is a description of our customer acquisition funnel. We could also write this as expected costs and benefits at every point in time, right? What would be the expected net benefit per period, each period, for a lead, right? So at time 0, it's just minus 2, because a lead costs us 2 with 100% probability at time 1. What would be the expected cost and benefit at time 1? Well, we know 2% of the time, right, we would get $100. And then 8% of the time, we would lose $5. What about at time 2? 2% of the 2 times 70% of the time, we would get 100. 100, not 1,000. Sorry. Plus 8% of the time, we would still get minus 5 times 3, right? So we can also think about mapping out this funnel where we explicitly compute what these expected cash flows are going to be. so on and so forth. So I'm assuming by ... that this is going to continue in perpetuity. So these are perpetual recurring customers. And so now the question is, well, what is the value of this sequence of costs and benefits? Right? So in order to answer this question, we're going to use a net present value framework. And what we're effectively going to be doing when we do this is we're going to be figuring out, well, what is the combined value of this sequence of cash flows where we properly take into account that future cash flows are less valuable than current cash flows because of something called the time value of money, right? Because we know if we want to get a certain amount of cash flow in the future, we don't need to invest the same amount today because we can earn interest on our investments. And so as a result, in order to, say, guarantee $100 10 years from now, we wouldn't need to invest as much. We would need to invest a lesser amount than that today to achieve that payoff. And so that payoff in the future is not worth quite as much today. And then another thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to account beyond time value of money. We're going to want to account for risk associated with these particular cash flows, because again, what we've described here are basically expected values, right? On average, we expect a customer, a paid customer at time 2 to stay as a customer 70% of the time. But for some customers, it's going to be they're going to churn with high probability, some with lower probability. And so there's uncertainty as to whether or not we're going to get exactly this level of cash flow. The more uncertainty you have, the less valuable that expected cash flow is in the future. And a net present value framework is kind of like the finance approach to account for all of these considerations. So whenever you want to undertake a valuation analysis, you want to do what we just did here as a first step. So step 1, forecast expected future cash flows, right? Which is the net benefits associated with this particular project, right? So more generically, we could write, the outcome of this step is that we would have, right, some number for cash flow 0, cash flow 1, cash flow 2, so on and so forth, right? So our estimate in this particular customer acquisition funnel for cash flow at time 0 is -2. Cash flow at time 1 is 2% of 100, which is just 2, minus 8% of -5. So whatever that nets out to would be our forecast for the average, the expected future cash flow 1 period from now associated with 1 lead that we would acquire from this customer acquisition funnel. And so this is our goal in our first step, is to analyze our customer acquisition funnel so that we can identify each of these forecasted cash flows. And then the second step, when we want to assess whether this customer acquisition funnel is effective or not, is, so I need to add a page here. Right, so step 2, right, which is going to incorporate 2 things. It's incorporate time value of money and um, risk premia associated with the fact that the cash flows that we've mapped out here are risky, associated with risky cash flows. And when we want to, we want to incorporate that into our consideration of how valuable a lead through this customer acquisition funnel is, right? The longer you have to wait to start getting costs and benefits from customer acquisition, the less valuable that customer acquisition is going to be. And of course, the more risky the cash flows associated with these customers are, also the less valuable this customer acquisition is going to be. And the way we incorporate this is by answering the following question. So goal of this step is to assess the fair rate of return on an investment. And when I say fair rate of return, it would be per period. So annual in this case, because we're forecasting annual cash flows, on an investment that has similar risk to this specific project, or where the project here is defined as go-to-market strategy. Or customer cash flows. Now, for now, I'm not going to discuss the methodology that we use in finance to answer this question. So we'll defer the introduction of methods from finance to assess this till our discussion of NPV for valuing startups. For now, I'm just going to assume that we know what the fair rate of return on an investment of similar risk to customer acquisition in this process is. So we're just going to take this fair rate of return, which I'll denote by R, so an R% rate of return per period, as given. In this specific example, I'm going to assume R is 20% per year. 20% per year, or 0.2. But given an answer for what the fair rate of return for an investment of similar risk to this customer acquisition, the third step we undertake is combining our answers from step 1 and step 3 into an assessment of the value of customer acquisition.
Sorry, Professor, I just have a question.
Yeah.
As a shortcut, could we just, as a shortcut and to avoid calculating an appropriate discount rate, could we just take the average rate of return from a VC index?
So that's a pretty good proxy to use for a discount rate. If you think the startup that you're valuing, or the customer acquisition that you're valuing, is kind of representative of a typical VC investment. Now, one thing that I generally advise doing, if you look at a index of VC investments, is, if you can, try to distinguish between earlier stage investments and later stage investments. Because what you'll systematically find is that the fair discount rate for an earlier stage investment is going to be higher than that of a later stage investment. So that's actually something that I've actually looked at using real world data on VC investments. And what I find is for later stage investments, again, I'm quoting just a real world number off of real world data. For late stage investments, a discount rate tends to be around 13%. For early stage investments, it's more like 16%. And the average across all VC investments is pretty much in the middle of those two numbers at about 14.5 to 14.75%. So absolutely, you can use that to draw some inference on what this discount rate might look like. Another thing that you can do is you can look at the discount rates, and this is what we're going to be discussing when we talk about some of the finance methods for assessing this discount rate, is that we look at similar companies traded in public markets that are that basically offer a similar, that are either in the same industry as your startup or offer kind of a similar product or service. So we're going to discuss an alternative approach that uses data from public markets. Now, of course, when you do that, you want to recognize the fact that companies that are publicly traded are going to tend to be more mature, obviously, than a startup, and so are going to be a bit less risky. So we're going to talk also about some adjustments that are made to discount rates to kind of ratchet up discount rates for a startup relative to a discount rate that you would estimate from companies that are traded in the stock market, again, using some methods from finance. In particular, the method from finance that I'll be introducing is something called the capital asset pricing model. Yeah, exactly. And I just want to defer the discussion of the CAPM because I want to focus more on the forecasting of the cash flows associated with a customer acquisition funnel and tying that to the value of the customer acquisition funnel, because we can really separate these steps. Step 2 is kind of a bit distinct from step 1 and step 3. So right now we're just focusing on the mechanics of step 1 and step 3. We'll discuss the mechanics of step 2 again, as I said, when we talk about doing similar net present value analysis, but for valuing an entire startup as opposed to valuing a specific customer lead.
Okay, thank you very much.
But certainly what you propose as a ballpark way of getting this discount rate is a pretty good first pass attempt for figuring out what this rate is. Now, of course, the challenge is to get data on a VC index that's kind of representative of the entire universe of VC investments. That's a little bit more challenging to find. So even implementing a calculation like that might be challenging to do in practice. But once we've done step 1 and step 2 to get the value of a customer acquisition funnel, so value of, I'm just going to call this value of a paid lead. This is going to be my notation for value of paid lead. What we'll do is we'll take our forecasted cash flows from step 1, and we're going to scale the value of each of these cash flows by the fair rate of return that we determine in step 2. So what we'll do is we'll take our future cash flows and we're going to scale those expected cash flows downwards to reflect a requirement on the part of investors to earn from their investment right now at time 0 that fair rate of return R on a per period basis. And this is called discounting. So sometimes this fair rate of return is also referred to in terms of terminology as a discount rate. And then we'd want to add up these discounted cash flows. It's also referred to as present value or a net present value because we're adding up the present values of each individual forecasted expected cash flow. And this would be the value of our lead. The logic behind this calculation is actually relatively straightforward, right? If we think about what we did in step 2, is we said, look, if we wanted to make a similar investment in terms of risk to this specific project, which is acquire a customer lead from this particular customer acquisition funnel, an investment of similar risk would generate a per period return of R. In other words, if you made an alternative investment that generates that fair rate of return, if you invested $1 today at time 0, and then you invested it for, let's say, big T periods. Well, if you earn the fair rate of return, on average, you would expect to have what? 1 plus your per period return with compounding. So you would expect to, have $1 today become 1 plus R to the power of T dollars in T periods. Now, another way to think about this is if you wanted to get an amount of dollars equal to, on average, cash flow T at time T, how much would you have to invest today at time 0 to get this? You would have to invest cash flow T over 1 plus R to the power of T dollars, because each of those dollars would generate 1 plus R T dollars after T periods. And so if you invested this much today in an investment of, again, similar risk characteristics to this specific project, you would on average expect to have cash flow T dollars T periods from now, right? Because you would multiply that for each $1 that you invest at time 0, you would get 1 plus RT dollars in T periods. We multiply these two numbers together, this times this, it gives us cash flow T. And so what does this basically tell us? It tells us if we wanted to purchase an average of cash flow T dollars in T periods at the level of risk of our current project, if we wanted to purchase that in an alternative way, and in particular, when we talk about the CAPM, we're going to be talking about making a comparable investment in of similar risk in equity markets, we would have to invest this much money today to get this much expected benefit in T periods. So if we wanted to get this much in T periods, right? So if we wanted to get on average cash flow $3 in 3 periods, we would have to invest this much today. To get cash flow 2 in 2 periods, we'd have to invest this much today. And so what this expression is telling you is how much you would need to invest today using alternative investment options. So in particular, we're going to be focusing on the alternative being that you try to generate a similar sequence of cash flows from public markets. In order to generate this full sequence of cash flows, you would have to invest this much to match the time 0 cash flow. That one's trivial because that's a non-investment. We would have to invest this much at time 0 to match an expected cash flow of cash flow 1 in 1 period. Invest another amount to match the cash flow at cash flow 2, cash flow at cash flow 3, so on and so forth. So adding up all of these present values tells us how much we would have to invest, say in public markets today, to generate a similar sequence of costs and benefits as this specific project generates. So that's kind of where the logic of net present value comes from. So let's go ahead and apply these net present value calculations to the customer acquisition funnel that we analyzed earlier. Oh, I see a question here from Juan Carlos. It says, should you consider perpetuity or different ranges per stage? I'm a little bit unclear of what you mean by different ranges per stage. In the specific example that we're assuming here, we're going to be assuming a perpetuity for the paid customer. But depending on your specific customer acquisition funnel, you can make alternative assumptions. So we could also assume, a paid customer generates these cash flows, but they only generate it for 5 periods. In that case, we would only add up these benefits, these net benefits of a paid customer for 5 periods, as opposed to kind of in perpetuity forever, as we're doing in this case. So this is, again, right now we're just kind of taking as given that we know what the funnel looks like. But in practice, it is, important to ask yourself, do you think, do you acquire a customer? Is it going to be a perpetual customer? Or do you have a sense of how long it would take for this customer to stop being a paid customer? And that's going to be material for whether or not acquiring a customer is valuable or not. So let's go ahead and calculate the NPV of a lead in this customer acquisition funnel. Right. So as we said before, we pay 2 right now. So value of a lead paid, right? It's the cash flow 0 plus expected cash flow 1 over 1 plus R to the 1, cash flow 2, 1 plus R squared, so on and so forth. Cash flow at time 0 for our customer acquisition funnel is -2, because for every lead we have to pay $2. And then, as we said, 2% of the time we get a paid customer. So I'll say value of a paid customer, value of a customer paid. 8% of the time we get the value of a customer free, and 90% of the time we get the value of no customer, which is just 0. So just like we can apply NPV to an entire lead, we can also apply NPV to determining the value of a paid customer and the value of a free customer separately. So it turns out in this particular exercise, the NPV of a lead will be given by -2 plus 2% of the time we get the value of a paid customer, and 8% of the time we get the value of a free customer, and we'll use NPV to determine each of these values. Now, in this particular case, because we had perpetual customers, there's actually kind of shortcut formulas that we can use for NPV. So I'll just introduce two specific shortcut NPV formulas. So 2 shortcut NPV formulas, one of which we'll use here. And the other one is going to be useful in the case that Juan Carlos was asking about, where you wouldn't keep a customer in perpetuity, but you would keep a customer for a finite amount of time. So first case I'll consider, this is called a growing perpetuity. So a growing perpetuity is an asset that generates a payment. It generates no cash flows at time 0, no cash flow at time 0. At time 1, so in this case in 1 year, it generates a payment P, and then that payment every period grows at a rate G. And that continues in perpetuity forever. We need to assume that this growth rate is lower than our discount rate R. So assume G is less than R. If we don't assume this, the NPV of this sequence of cash flow is going to be infinite. But if this constant growth rate is less than our discount rate, the NPV of this sequence of cash flows, this growing perpetuity, is given by the simple formula P divided by R minus G. And G here can be a negative number as well. This shortcut formula basically just comes from the mathematical formula for the sum of a geometric series, an infinite geometric series. And then another shortcut formula that can be helpful, we're not going to be using it in this specific example, is the shortcut formula for a growing annuity. An annuity is basically an asset that doesn't pay payoffs forever. Instead, it pays payoffs for a finite number of periods. And with a growing annuity, those per period payments, just like with a growing perpetuity, grow at a constant rate G until the payments stop. So with a growing annuity, our cash flows at time 0, it's 0. At time 1, it's P like before. And then it grows at a rate 1 plus G every period until time big T, where it would be P grown at this constant growth rate for T minus 1 periods. And then afterwards, at T equals T plus 1 and beyond, you would always get a 0 cash flow payment. So with an annuity, the payments eventually stop. There's a relatively simple formula for this growing annuity as well. That formula is given by NPV equals P times R minus G times 1 over 1 plus G over 1 plus R to the power of T. So these are useful formulas to remember when you want to do this type of unit economic analysis, because it can kind of streamline the calculations that you have to do. So we'll go ahead and use the growing perpetuity formula in this case, because I'm assuming in this customer acquisition funnel that you keep customers forever. It's just that they're dropping at a rate of 30% per year. Right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to use this NPV formula to get the value of a paid customer. What's the value of a paid customer? Well, that paid customer is going to give us 120 minus 20 in one period. So that would be discounted by 20%. And then 70% of the time, we would get 120 minus 20 in 2 periods, so that would be discounted by 2 periods, so on and so forth. Well, notice this is just a growing perpetuity with a value of P equal to 100, because that's the first payment that it pays, right? And a growth rate of minus 30%, because every period that payment is falling by 30% because of the churn rate, and with a discount rate of 20%. So using the perpetuity formula, we can figure out, well, what is the value of a paid customer? Value of a paid customer is 120 minus 20, the 100, divided by R, our 20% discount rate, minus our growth rate, where our growth rate is actually, it's a negative number. It's minus 30%, right, because of that churn rate. And so if we do this, we get a number equal to 100 divided by 0.5. So it's just 200, right? So what we've assessed so far is we pay $2 for a lead. 2% of the time, we get something worth $200. 8% of the time, what do we get? We get a guaranteed minus $5 in perpetuity per period. But notice this stream of cash flows is also a growing perpetuity. It just happens to be a perpetuity with a growth rate of 0, right? So what would be the value of a free customer? It's minus 5 divided by R minus G, where G is 0, so it's just divided by R. So divided by 20%, again, just for completion, minus a growth rate of 0. And so that gives us minus 25. Right, so if we're analyzing this specific customer acquisition funnel, we can see what is the value of a lead. The value of a lead is what? We pay $2 right now for the lead. 2% of the time, in exchange for that $2, we receive 200, and 8% of the time, we get minus 25. Right, so we can do the math here. So 8% of minus 25 is, I think it's minus 2. Minus 2. This is minus 2, and then 2% of 200 would be 4. Right, so in this particular example, I may have made a mistake in calculating this in my head, but in this particular case, the NPV of our lead would be 0. Now, what does an NPV of 0 mean? What it means is, given the assumptions we've made of our customer acquisition funnel here, acquiring a lead neither destroys nor adds value. Right, so each lead, we pay as much in purchasing the lead as we expect to get as net benefits from, the possibility that that lead becomes either a paid or free customer in the future. Meanwhile, if you get a number that's greater than 0 here, given the assumptions we've made about our customer acquisition funnel, each lead would have positive value and would be adding value to the firm. If we got an answer that was less than 0, each lead would be strictly destroying value. Okay, so this is just kind of our first example of using basic NPV calculations to assess the value of a lead. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to resolve this problem, but where I'm going to add an additional complication, which is going to be that in addition to generating these direct cash flows, right? So paid customers generate 100, then 70, then 49 on average in each subsequent period. Free customers always generate minus 5. In addition to that, both types of customers are going to generate an additional source of value through referrals that they make, so that every lead that we pay is also expected to be generating free leads in the future. That's going to pop up the value of our customer acquisition funnel. And so next we'll discuss how we can incorporate these referrals in our NPV analysis. Again, NPV analysis on a customer acquisition funnel, oftentimes in practice in terms of terminology, this is referred to as unit economic analysis. So that's what we're going to do next. All right, we might as well continue with our discussion of unit economic analysis. As I mentioned before the break, I'm going to do an example where we figure out how the value of a paid lead changes when we have referrals. But before doing this, I think I'm going to highlight one other example where we slightly change the funnel that we have here, just to kind of highlight how flexible this valuation-based approach is for assessing the value of customer acquisition. So one thing I definitely want to point out is that when you want to do a unit economic analysis, it's definitely useful to take this approach to determining the value of a lead, where you break down getting the value of your paid lead into sub-steps where you compute the value of your different types of customers separately, because usually it's easier to analyze one customer in isolation, right? So analyze the value of a paid customer in isolation than it is to try to combine all the different types of customers into one direct NPV calculation. The reason for that is that, for instance, in this example here, we assumed that there was a constant growth rate in the cash flows associated with a paid customer, namely a negative 30% growth rate. When we have a constant growth rate, either for perpetual cash flows or for annuities, we can take advantage of these two shortcut formulas for getting NPV. And so that's very convenient to use at the individual customer level. But whenever you've got different customers exhibiting different growth rates, you can apply those formulas to the combined total of your different customers. So it's not like you can use a growing perpetuity formula to get the value of paid and free customers combined, because what will happen in that specific case is that we're going to have overall for the company a growth rate in cash flows that's not constant, because we get a minus 30% growth rate from our paid customers. We get a 0% growth rate from our free customers. As our paid customer base becomes a smaller component of our cash flows, right, the growth rate for our overall cash flows are going to start to resemble more the growth rate from our free customer base than our paid customer base. So in this example, right, if we tried to in one step combine paid and free customers, we would need to factor in a declining growth rate over time, and that's very difficult to do in one step. So I highly recommend, whenever you do a unit economic analysis, right, to get the value of your overall funnel, so the value of a lead in the funnel, first separate out the NPVs of your different customer tiers. So in this case here, we only have 2 customer tiers, but more generally, we could have any number of customer tiers as well. We just have to do an NPV calculation for all the different types of customers. So I'll just kind of highlight one other calculation where I'm going to make one change to the customer acquisition funnel. So in particular, the slight change that I'm going to make to my calculations here, I'm going to still continue to make the same assumption for paid customers, but I'm going to make a change in the assumptions of a free customer. In particular, for a free customer, what I'll assume is that the free customer is a free customer for 5 years. So at time 1, they generate -5, time 2, they generate -5, all the way up to time 5, when they generate another -5. And then after time 5, one of 2 things can happen to a free customer. They can either become a paid customer or they just disappear, as in like they never generate a cash flow after time 5. So in this alternative scenario, right, we would have a different value for our free customer. Obviously, the value of a free customer would go up, because in this alternative scenario, I'm assuming that the negative cash flows don't last as long, right? They last for 5 periods instead of in perpetuity. And there's some possibility that a free customer generates value in the future, because at year 5, there's a 10% chance that they would become a paid customer. So in that slightly altered scenario, what would be the value of a free customer? In this new scenario, alternative scenario, right, the value of a free customer would be what? It would now be -5 discounted 1 period, all the way up to -5 discounted for 5 periods. And then, right, what I assumed is after 5 periods, one of 2 things happens. 10% of the time, they become a paid customer, in which case, right after the -5 cash flow at time 5, you would receive or you would effectively receive the value of a paid customer, right? And then 90% of the time, I'm assuming that the customer just disappears, so generates a value of 0. Right, so this is an expected benefit that you would expect to get at time 5 after the -5 cash flow at that point in time. And so since this is a benefit you receive in 5 periods, you would discount that by 5 periods as well. Now, of course, we already calculated the value of a paid customer. It's 200. So the value that we would get at time 5 would now be, again, on average 20 after this -5 cash flow. So we could also calculate the value of a free customer in this case. And again, it's useful in these examples to kind of identify how we can use the shortcut formulas to get our NPV. So one thing that we can notice with the value of a free customer now is that this segment of the cash flows associated with a free customer is basically a growing annuity with a 0 growth rate. So we can use our shortcut formula for a growing annuity to get the NPV of these cash flows. It would just be what? It would be P, which is -5, over R minus G, which is just 20% minus the 0%, times 1 minus 1 plus G, where G is 0, so it's just 1, over 1.2 to the power of 5, because we've got 5 periods of payments in this annuity. And then to that, we would add the benefit that we can potentially get in 5 periods because of conversion into paid customer, which would be 10% of 200 discounted by 5 periods. So we can use our shortcut formula to get this part of the valuation, and then we just do a single discounting to get this part of the valuation. And so in this specific scenario, this alternative scenario, the value of a free customer, if you just do the math, if you calculate this and then add this, you would get a value for a free customer of -6.92. Right, so again, this illustrates the fact that in the alternative scenario that I just proposed, the value of a free customer is higher than in the case where they just stay a free customer forever. It's still negative, but it's gone up a bit. And because it goes up a bit, then obviously the value of a lead would go up as well. What would be the new value of a lead in this alternative scenario? It would still be -2 because we always pay that for a lead, plus 2% times value of a paid customer, which I assumed is unchanged at 200, plus 8% of the time, we would now, instead of getting -25, we would get -6.92. So if you do the math here, you would get a value of a paid lead of $1.45. So if you just do the math, that's the number that you would get. And so what this would be saying is, in this new scenario, which is an improved customer acquisition funnel, because you're in some sense limiting you're reducing the negative value of a free customer by sometimes converting them into a paid customer. If you were able to accomplish that improvement to your customer acquisition funnel, you would move from having a value of a lead of 0, which we initially had, to value of a paid lead of $1.45. And what this means is that every lead that you acquire through this customer acquisition funnel, given the assumptions that we've made in our modeling of the funnel, would be adding $1.45 on average to the value of the startup when you net out the costs of acquiring the customer and the potential benefits associated with acquiring the customers. And so what this is meant to highlight is just how flexible this NPV framework is for allowing us to calculate the value of paid customer acquisition. Because once we make our assumptions of what our funnel, customer acquisition funnel and customer retention looks like, doing the valuation exercise is something that we can perform very flexibly for, you know, a variety of different customer acquisition funnels of potentially even, you know, relatively high complexity. And that's kind of an exercise that you guys are going to be asked to do in the unit economics problem that I'm going to post as part of the problem set. As I said, I'm going to post that tomorrow. One thing that I want to note about the problem sets is the problem sets, I try to kind of specify realistic valuation questions. And so sometimes they're going to be a little bit more complex than the examples we're doing in class. And because I realize that those examples are a little bit more complex, I also realize that you guys might find it challenging to work through those exercises. So one thing I want to highlight is whenever I hold my office hours, which my office hours are going to be on Thursdays, I know that tomorrow evening you guys have an evening event. I don't know if the evening events are every week, but I'll take a look at what the your schedules as a group look like on Thursdays, and I'll on the basis of that figure out when I'm exactly going to hold those Thursday office hours. If it's not convenient, I can also move to a different day. But you guys shouldn't hesitate to. Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So for future Thursdays, I guess I'll plan to be available from 5 to 9 p.m. To even address any challenges that you guys have in solving homework problems as well. So you guys shouldn't hesitate if you guys are hitting a stumbling block where you guys don't feel you're making progress in solving some of these problems. Don't hesitate to come to my office hour and ask me questions, because I'll be willing to help you guys through some of those challenges, because I really do want you guys to appreciate just how flexible this unit economics framework is. Dimension of flexibility that I want you guys to be comfortable with incorporating into this analysis is the possibility of referrals. So now I'm going to move away from the alternative scenario. So I'll go back to assuming that a free customer is getting you -5 in direct cash flows on a perpetual basis. But in addition to the cash flows that we modeled initially, right, the 100, 70, 49, so on and so forth, and the -5, -5 in perpetuity, I'm going to assume that there's another source of value associated with both paid and free customers, which is lead referrals. And so in particular, I'm going to assume now that so I'm going to go back to the original funnel that we did before the break. But we're going to add referrals. In particular, I'm going to assume each paid customer refers 10 additional leads. Now, to be clear, these referrals are leads, not automatically converted customers. And then each free customer refers 5 additional leads. I'm also going to assume the quality of referred leads is equal to the quality of paid leads. With one exception. The startup doesn't need to pay for the referred leads. Now, what does this assumption imply? It implies that the value, remember we had previously the value of a paid lead. This assumption means that the value of a referred lead is going to be equal to the value of a paid lead because it generates the same benefit as a paid lead, but it's going to be worth even more than a paid lead because you won't need to pay the $2 to get the lead, right? The paid leads you have to pay $2 for, and then you would get some possibility of benefits in the future. With a referred lead, you get those same possibilities of benefits in the future, but you don't need to pay the $2 up front. So by that assumption, there's this clear relationship between the value of a paid lead and the value of a referred lead. And so in this scenario, how can we obtain the value of paid leads, right? Because these paid leads generate additional referred leads, the value of a paid lead is going to go up relative to our previous example where we had gotten a value of 0. And how do we incorporate the value of referrals into our unit economic analysis? Again, let's map out our funnel. We get -2, 2% of the time. We get the value of a paid customer. 8% of the time, just like before. We get the value of a free customer. And then 90% of the time we get 0. But what changes now relative to our previous example is when we look at the value of paid and free customers, we can split up the value of the customers into 2 pieces. A direct value associated with a given customer, plus from that same customer, a value of the referral that they provide. Now, why is it useful to break the valuation of our paid, or in this case, our paid customer in this way? It's because the value of the direct payments that are made by the customer, solving for this NPV is exactly the same as what we had done before, right? Because the direct cash flows associated with that customer are still 100 in one period, on average 70 in 2 periods, so on and so forth. So when we have referrals, computing this part doesn't change. Doesn't change with or without referrals. So in this case here, since the only thing we've done is we've added the referrals, the direct value of a paid customer would still be $200. But in addition to that, now that we've added these referrals, the paid customer would also generate what? They would generate the value of their referrals. What's the value of the referrals? There are 10 referrals, and each referral generates a value, given our assumption here, equal to the value of a paid lead plus 2. Right? So basically what we're doing is we're recognizing that a paid customer gives us 2 sources of value. One source of value from its direct business, and one source of value that comes from the value of the referrals that they provide to us. By the way, in our calculations here, I've assumed that the 10 referrals occur once at t equals 0. Same thing for the free customers. the 5 referrals occur once at t equals 0 as well, which is why when I take the value, I take the value of the referrals times 10 because there's 10 of them. But notice I don't do any discounting or anything because the referrals happen immediately. And you'll notice that I'm only adding one batch of referrals, right? 10 referrals today, meaning that I'm not, I'm assuming no referrals after time 0. So in this particular case, a paid customer refers 10 additional leads right now, but after this period, they never refer additional paid leads in the future. In the problem that you guys are gonna do in the problem set, you're asked to solve a slightly different case where you get leads every, this is gonna be a later part of the problem in that problem set, but you're gonna have a case where referrals occur every period. In that case, the way that we get the value of a paid lead isn't going to be kind of like a single shot of the value of referrals. It's going to be like a perpetuity of referrals. So we're going to use a perpetuity formula along with this implicit value of a referred lead to get the value of overall referrals associated with this customer. I see a couple of hands up. I think Jiajun had their hand up first, so maybe Jiajun can ask the question first, and Juan Carlos can ask the question second. Yes, Jiajun.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit confused of why the referrals value happens at t0, because in our original calculation that we assume the revenue will generate from the future, and why you can't assume that the referrals value is at t0, so and we don't discount that. So yeah, that's basically my concern.
Okay, so let me be clear. I'm just illustrating this via example. So I've just assumed that the referrals happen right away, right? In the real world, when you're trying to when you're thinking about modeling customer referrals, you absolutely want to keep track of what the timing of the referrals are. So it makes a difference whether a customer that you acquired gives you referrals today or gives you referrals at a later point in the future. If you look at your customer referral behavior in the data and you find that there's a lag between customer joining and customer referral, sometimes that lag is very brief, sometimes it's longer, then you would definitely want to discount this this expression that I have in a circle. So if we want to just kind of build on your question and present an alternative scenario, right? If referral happened at, let's say, t equals 2, then instead of adding 10 times v paid plus 2, we would add 10 times v paid lead plus 2 because we get 10 referrals. But yes, we would have to take that number and discount it for, in this case, 2 periods. So you're absolutely right. Depending on the actual pattern of customer referrals, you might want to do your you'll want to do your calculations differently to precisely account for the timing of the referrals. By assuming that the referrals happened immediately and just one time, in this example, my objective is not to tell you that that's an assumption that's always made. It was just to kind of highlight, given this assumption, how do we do this unit economics exercise? Does that make more sense?
So basically we just find the present value of a paid lead, and then we just assume like one paid lead. Well, let's say in this case, give us like 10 additional leads plus $2, and we all assume that, like the 10 leads all assume that happens in t0. But is that basically?
Yeah, exactly. So here we assume all of the 10 leads happen at t equals referrals happen at time 0. If instead we assume that the referrals were made at time 2, instead of using this expression, for the value of referrals from paid customers, we would use this expression instead, right? Because we would want to account for the fact that the referrals happen in 2 periods rather than at time 0, like I assumed initially. Right, so these are just basically 2 different customer acquisition patterns, right? One has immediate referrals, the other one has delayed referrals. And in practice, you know, both of these things could happen. So you want to, you know, when we talk about implementing unit economic analysis, in terms of measuring the customer acquisition funnel, I mean, this is one of the things that you would want to take a look at data on, right? How much time does it take for a referral to be made? And does it happen just once, or does it happen on multiple occasions, right? So another alternative, so this is, let's say, alternative 1, is if we had a delayed referral at time 2, right? And this would be our expression for V paid referral. Another alternative could be, for instance, how would we calculate the value of these referrals, so alternative 2, if instead we had referrals every period. Every period, let's say starting at t equals 1. Well, in that case, notice the referrals would essentially be a perpetuity, because every period you would be receiving this much value, right? So in that case, again, this is a third scenario. How would we get the value of paid referrals? Well, it would be given by the value of our first batch of referrals, which is 10 times V paid referral plus 2. But since we would be receiving this every period starting at time 1, let's assume we only got the referrals if a customer was still a customer. So that means this number would be declining by 30% per year as well, because 30% of our customers are stopping being paid customers, and so they stop making referrals every period as well. So we could view this actually in this particular scenario, right? So referrals every period, but only if customer stays, right? So it doesn't churn. Then the value of paid referrals would be the value of this first batch of referrals divided by R minus G. Again, going back to referring to our shortcut formula for a growing perpetuity. This would be a growing perpetuity, R of 20%. And since we assume that you don't get referrals once a customer churns, it would be a minus 30% growth rate. And so this would be equal to, in this particular case, 20 times V ref paid plus 2. Right? So when we're thinking about getting an expression for the value of referrals, this can be very flexible. You know, it can be a scenario where you just have one batch of referrals right now. You could have one batch of referrals at any date in the future, and you can have multiple referrals, right? If you have referrals in perpetuity, you would use a perpetuity formula. You could also have a scenario where you believe that you'll get multiple rounds of referrals from a customer, but it's going to be a finite number of referrals. So you'll get maybe one referral a year for 5 years. Then in order to get the value of your paid referrals, you would now use an annuity formula rather than the perpetuity formula. Right? So this just highlights how flexible this methodology is. You can adapt this unit economic analysis to any number of different customer acquisition funnels. Right, but let's go back to this original assumption, right? So we're moving away from alternative 1 and 2 now and going back to just a single batch of 10 referrals by paid customers at time 0. So in that case, the value of a paid customer would be what? 200 plus 10 times whatever the value of a paid lead is plus 2. Similarly, what would be the value of a free customer? Value of a free customer we could also represent as the direct value associated with a free customer plus the referral value associated with that customer. And just as with the paid customer case, right, our calculation of the direct business that a free customer generates would be exactly the same as our prior example. So -5 in perpetuity. So this would still be equal to -25. But now, in addition to losing $25 in value from needing to service the free customer in perpetuity, we would also get a positive, potentially positive source of value from the free customer referrals. Again, we're assuming now 5 referrals also occurring at time 0. So the value of the referrals by free customers in this scenario would be what? 5 times value of a free customer. Sorry, 5 times the value of a paid lead plus 2, right? Because those referrals, just like with the referrals with from the paid customer, we're assuming have the same quality as paid leads, with the exception that you don't need to pay the $2 this $2 cost. So let's be clear. This number here, right? That's the cost of the lead, of paid lead, right? How much you pay to acquire a lead from a particular lead vendor, for instance. So this would be the value of the referrals for each customer type. Now I'm going to show you guys how to get the value of a paid lead given these observations. But I realize now I forgot about Juan Carlos's question. So Juan, feel free to just ask your question now, and then I'll continue and finalize our unit economic analysis in this specific funnel. So,
yeah, I figured my initial question, but now are you considering the referrals from the free ones also producing revenue? Why are you using VPaid lead in that case?
Yeah. So it's important to like understand the assumptions I'm making when I'm solving this problem. So exactly. So like I'm assuming that the referrals that free customers make are just as valuable as the referrals that paid customers make, right? So, and in particular, both of these sets of referrals are similar to the paid leads, except that you don't need to pay the $2. Now that's an assumption, right? If you believe that's not a good assumption, so for instance, maybe you would believe that the referrals coming from free customers are less valuable than the referrals coming from paid customers. Maybe because, a free customer is more likely to refer a free customer than a paid customer, for instance. In that case, you could reflect this in your calculations as well. So for instance, if you believed that the referrals by free customers were only half as valuable as the referrals coming from paid customers, then you could incorporate this in your calculations here by just saying, well, each of the 5 referrals are worth half as much as the ones coming from paid customers, right? So you can actually incorporate a host of different assumptions in this framework, so long as you have clarity on what the difference between the value of a paid lead and a referred lead from a paid customer and a referred lead from a free customer are. Does that clarify a bit?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So again, this is meant to highlight how flexible this exercise, this unit economic analysis is, because you can reflect a large number of different views about the customer acquisition funnel and the referral dynamics, and still kind of undertake this valuation analysis. But I'll go back to the example where I was assuming that the referrals coming from both paid customers and free customers are the same quality as the paid leads, except that we don't need to pay the $2 cost for purchasing that lead. So given these assumptions, how can we determine what the value of a paid lead is? Well, by definition, the value of a paid lead, right, the definition of NPV, is equal to what? It's equal to the NPV that you expect to get post acquiring the lead. So you pay $2 for the lead. 2% of the time, you get the value of a paid customer. What's the value of a paid customer? It's 200 plus 10 V lead paid plus 2. And then 8% of the time, you get the value of a free customer, which was minus 25 plus 5 times V lead paid plus 2. So notice, actually, this might seem like a complicated exercise to solve, because you might think like the following. You might say, well, it's impossible for me to calculate the value of a paid lead without knowing, a paid customer, without knowing the value of a paid lead. And so I can't figure out the value of a paid lead until I know the value of a paid lead. So how can I solve for this? So you might think that this is this requires some sort of circular analysis, but it turns out, given our assumption about the quality of referrals being the same as the quality of paid leads, with the exception of not needing to pay for the lead, there's actually a relatively simple way to solve for the value of a paid lead, because, again, by the definition of an NPV, this equation needs to hold. But notice this equation is just one equation, one unknown. And in fact, it's just a linear equation. It turns out in all the standard assumptions that we make about referrals, we always end up with linear equations to solve. So, we can just solve in this particular case for V paid lead, right? So just, solving this math here, we would get V paid lead equals to minus 2 plus 2% of 200. So 2% of 200, which is 4, plus 10 times 2, 20 times 2%, that's 0.4. Plus 8% of minus 25, that's minus 2. Plus 8% times 5 times 2. Let's see, what is that? That's 10, that's 0.8. Right? And now I'm just going to gather up my V lead terms from the right-hand side of the equation. So I would have 2% times 10. So plus 0.2 times V lead paid plus 0.4, which is 0.8 times 5 times V lead paid. And so we can just bring the V lead paid terms to the left-hand side of the equation, right? So we gather, these terms, we move them. Again, I'm just solving a simple linear equation here. We move to the other side of the equation. Sorry that this is getting a little bit messy on the slides. But the that would give us the expression 1 minus 0.2 minus 0.4 times V lead paid, which is just 0.6. And what we'd still have on the right-hand side of the equation is just minus 2 plus 4 plus 0.4 minus 2 plus 0.8. That's 1.2. Oh, by the way, this is not 0.6, it's 0.4, right? This is 1 minus 0.2 minus 0.4, which gives us 0.4. And so now we'd have the expression 0.4 V lead paid equals to 1.2. We just divide by 0.4 on both sides of the equation, and it tells us that the value of a lead would be 3, right? This is equal to 1.2 divided by 0.4. Right, so even though in some sense we don't know the value of a paid customer until we know the value of a paid lead, through this NPV equation, we're able to circumvent that potential challenge by just mathematically solving this one equation, one unknown. By the way, one thing I'll point out about our solution process here, right? So just, you know, one thing to remember is when you have referrals and you make the assumption that the quality of referrals is related to the quality of paid leads, you're going to end up with this type of NPV equation where the value of paid leads shows up on both sides of the equation. And another thing I want to point out is that the value that we get from solving this equation, namely value of a paid lead equals to 3, that doesn't just incorporate the value of the referrals that our customers generate. In solving this problem, we're also, when determining the value of a paid lead, incorporating the value not just of the 10 customers that, for instance, a paid customer would refer immediately, but it also incorporates the possibility that those 10 referrals will also generate an additional batch of referrals. It also incorporates referrals of referrals, referrals of referrals of referrals. It accounts for all of those possibilities. So it really is factoring in every potential source of value that is generated by a paid lead. So it's not just, you know, this NPV equation is actually picking up the possibility of multiple batches of referrals, but coming from different customers, right? So a referral coming from a referral, as I said, and so on and so forth. And hopefully we agree that if you wanted to figure out the value of a paid lead, you'd want to incorporate those higher order sources of value, because a referral of a referral would never potentially occur unless the first referral happened. And that first referral wouldn't happen unless you paid for the original lead. So you do want to incorporate all of those sources of value when you do this type of unit economic analysis. And it's convenient that we're able to do this in a fairly simple analytical way by just boiling down our valuation problem into this kind of one equation, one unknown type expression. Are folks okay with this? Are there any questions about the solution process for unit economics when we have referrals? So maybe what I'll do is in addition to the problem that I'm going to post for the problem set, I'll post an additional solved example where we solve through a different customer acquisition funnel with referrals, where I'm going to make a different set of assumptions so that you guys can see, you know, how you would solve this problem in an alternative funnel to again, to help you ideally become as comfortable as possible in doing this type of analysis. So I'll post an extra example. I'll try to do it tomorrow. If I don't have time to write up that example tomorrow, I'll do it on Friday. how do we decide whether or not we're ready to aggressively scale this customer acquisition funnel? So in typical net present value analysis, we say that a project is worthwhile to undertake if the NPV of the project is greater than 0. An NPV greater than 0 rule is just, in the context of our unit economic analysis, is getting an answer for V paid lead that's greater than 0. Right? So if we use kind of a standard decision rule that we would normally use in other finance settings, we would say so long as the value of a paid lead is greater than 0, we should start accelerating this specific customer acquisition funnel. That's not the rule that practitioners generally use, so both startups and in terms of advice that are given by VCs. So generally, when you're deciding on whether you're ready to aggressively scale or not, you generally want a margin of safety above 0 in your value for your paid lead. And there's a specific reason for that, which is usually when we estimate all these parameters of our customer acquisition funnel, right? So when we're estimating, okay, every paid customer refers 10 additional leads, every free customer generates 5 additional leads, the probability that a lead becomes a paid customer is 2%, right? All of these numbers, the way we get them in practice is by looking at historical data on our customer acquisition, right? On the success of our customer acquisition. And when we do this analysis, we're assuming that all of those parameters of the customer acquisition dynamics are going to stay constant over time, so they won't be changing in the future. So we're assuming that the historical effectiveness of our customer acquisition is going to stay constant as we scale, as we go from small scale marketing tests to aggressively scaling in phase 3 of the startup life cycle. And most of the time for startups, that's not a realistic assumption. For most startups, as you start to aggressively scale, usually the effectiveness of your funnel starts to erode. So that, like, if historically at a small scale of customer acquisition, you were acquiring paid customers 2% of the time, we generally would expect that probability to fall a little bit in the future when we start accelerating customer acquisition. One reason being that as we accelerate customer acquisition, we need to start trying to acquire more challenging customer types to acquire, right? Because generally you try to acquire the easiest customers to acquire first, and then progressively you move on to customers that are more difficult to acquire. So if only for that reason, generally we expect a funnel for empirically for most startups, this is what happens, is that as they start to aggressively scale, the funnel gets a little bit worse. And so because of that, we don't want to use just our historical funnel parameters, right? To assess a value for our scaled up paid customer acquisition. Generally, we want the number to be above 0 to reflect the possibility or the expectation that customer acquisition is going to become a bit more challenging in the future. And so how do we kind of decide what sort of hurdle above a V paid lead of 0 we want to have to justify, validating that we have a go-to-market fit and starting our aggressive scaling process? There are kind of 2 approaches that are used in practice to assess this. I'll only focus on one right now, and which is undertaking a sensitivity analysis in our valuation of a paid lead, right? So what we've done in this exercise is we solve for the value of paid lead using our historical funnel parameters, right? But one thing we might want to do in practice to see whether we've got a sufficient margin of safety to justify scaling aggressively would be to solve the same valuation exercise, but with altered funnel parameters that reflect our views of how much a funnel might erode as we start to scale customer acquisition. So maybe, for instance, we would expect our ability to convert a paid lead into a paid customer would fall from 2% to 1.5%. So we would resolve this problem with 1.5% as our number for conversion into paid customers. Maybe we would expect over time less referrals by each customer type. So maybe we would expect 7 referrals from paid customers and 2 referrals from free ones. Then we would incorporate that view by saying 7, and I think I said 2 here. Right, so we can reflect our views of how much a funnel can erode, resolve this problem, and see with this worsened funnel, do we still have a value of a lead when we, again, solve for one equation, one unknown, again, in this alternative scenario with an eroding funnel, do we still get a value for paid leads that's greater than 0? And if we still get a value for paid leads that's greater than 0 with a realistically eroded funnel, then that would suggest that we can scale this customer acquisition strategy because we know that as we scale it, we expect the funnel to erode a bit, but despite that erosion, we would still expect each lead that we acquire through this funnel to still be adding value. So that's one approach that practitioners occasionally use to assess whether they're ready to scale. They calculate the value of a lead as we did using, historical data on the effectiveness of customer acquisition and customer retention and referral. But they also reperform the analysis with alternative numbers. That's what we call a sensitivity analysis to reflect the possibility of a funnel getting worse. And they look to see in these alternative scenarios, worsened scenarios, do paid leads still continue to add value? And so what that means is if the value of a paid lead is above 0 but sufficiently small, so if this was sufficiently small, even if it was positive, when we did our sensitivity analysis, resolving the problem with a worsened funnel, we would then find that in this worsened funnel scenario, we would get a negative value of leads. So even though using our historical customer acquisition dynamics, acquiring new leads would be profitable, we wouldn't nonetheless start scaling our customer acquisition aggressively, because we'd be worried that as we do that, things would get worse and things would quickly flip from positive value add from customer acquisition to negative value add. So that's one approach that practitioners use. There's another approach used by practitioners that involves looking at some related metrics to our value of lead calculations that we've done here. And in particular, they're related to the notion of computing a cost of customer acquisition and the long-term value of our paid customers. And so there's some practitioner-based guidance on how we can use those slightly different metrics to decide whether we're ready to aggressively scale or not. But in the interest of time, I won't cover that in class right now. And what I'll do instead is I'll introduce that alternative approach to deciding whether we're ready to aggressively scale or not as an appendix in my problem statement for the unit economics question in the problem set.